A boss orders his own captain's gunned down inside a Brooklyn nightclub. An FBI agent slips so deep undercover the mafia nearly makes him a made man. A godfather everyone called untouchable becomes, decades later, the first five-family boss in history to testify against his own men. This is why the Bonanno family story is worse than Goodfellas. Section 1. The village that exported murder. There is a small port town on the northwestern coast of Sicily called Castellammare del Golfo, and if a person walked through it today, they would see fishing boats, whitewashed buildings, and a harbor that looks almost peaceful enough to make anyone forget what this particular stretch of coastline actually produced. For more than a century, this single town sent more men into the highest levels of organized crime in America than almost anywhere else in the world, and the story of how that happened, how one small Sicilian fishing village became the seedbed for one of New York's five families, says something important about this entire history before a single body ever hits the ground. The town's name itself gives away part of the story. Castellammare del Golfo translates roughly to Sea Castle of the Gulf, and the actual fortress that once anchored the harbor had, by the time the families this account will follow were growing up there, become mostly ceremonial, a landmark rather than a functioning defense. What still functioned, and functioned with a strength that would eventually cross an entire ocean intact, was the town's particular culture of family loyalty, blood obligation, and a deep, generational suspicion of any authority coming from outside the immediate clan. Sicily itself had spent centuries under one foreign ruler after another. Norman kings, Spanish viceroys, French administrators, each new government arriving with its own laws and its own taxes, and very little genuine interest in whether ordinary Sicilians actually survived the transition. Out of that long history of outside rule grew something that would define organized crime across an entire island and, eventually, across the ocean it eventually crossed. A conviction that the family, not the state, represented the only structure a person could actually trust with his life. Criminal networks connected to Castellammare del Golfo were already documented as far back as the 1880s, decades before the men who would eventually build the Bonanno family in New York were even born. These early organizations operated according to a logic that would remain essentially unchanged for the following century. Small, tightly bound groups of men connected by blood or marriage, controlling territory and resolving disputes without any meaningful involvement from official Italian law enforcement, which most residents of towns like Castellammare regarded as, at best, useless, and at worst, another predator to be managed rather than trusted. The man whose name would eventually attach itself permanently to this specific criminal lineage was born in this town on January 18, 1905. His full name was Giuseppe Carlo Bonanno, though history would eventually know him by an Americanized version of that name, and by a nickname that stuck to him for the rest of his very long life. Joseph Bonanno's own father was already connected to organized criminal activity back in Sicily, meaning young Giuseppe grew up inside this specific culture of blood loyalty and clan obligation from the moment he was old enough to understand what the adults around him were actually discussing at the dinner table. At the age of 3, his family emigrated to New York, settling among the growing community of fellow Castellammarese immigrants who had already begun establishing themselves in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, a neighborhood that would remain closely tied to this specific criminal lineage for decades. Bonanno's family did not stay in America permanently during this first stretch. After roughly a decade in New York, they moved back to Sicily, a detail that matters considerably for understanding how thoroughly young Joseph absorbed the specific culture of his home region before eventually returning to build his life and his criminal career in an entirely different country. He was not simply an American boy with distant Sicilian roots. He was a man who had spent his formative years directly inside the actual town and the actual culture that had produced this specific criminal tradition, giving him a depth of connection to the old country that many of his eventual rivals in New York, born and raised entirely in America, never possessed to nearly the same degree. In 1924, at 19 years old, Bonanno made his way back to the United States by a route that itself illustrates the general lawlessness surrounding immigration during this period. Stowing away aboard a Cuban fishing boat bound for Tampa, Florida, and slipping back into the country without any of the formal documentation that might have made his return visible to American authorities. He found his way back to the same Brooklyn neighborhood his family had once called home, and back into the same network of Castellamarese immigrants who had continued building their own version of the old country's clan structure inside the streets of Williamsburg during the years the Bonanno family had spent back in Sicily. By the mid-1920s, organized crime in New York had already grown into something considerably larger and more consequential than the loose networks of Sicilian immigrant families that had first taken root decades earlier. Prohibition, which had gone into effect nationally in 1920, created an enormous and enormously profitable black market for alcohol, and criminal organizations across the entire country scrambled to control the production, smuggling, and distribution of liquor flowing through cities, desperate for a product the government had just declared illegal. In New York specifically, several major organizations had already formed around different ethnic and neighborhood-based networks, with Italian-American criminal groups increasingly dominant among them, though these groups themselves remained divided along old-world regional lines that carried more weight inside this specific culture than most outside observers understood at the time. One particularly consequential division existed between criminals who traced their origins to Castellammare del Golfo specifically, and criminals connected to other parts of Sicily, and this division, seemingly a matter of nothing more than which specific town a man's grandfather happened to come from, would eventually produce one of the most consequential wars in the entire history of American organized crime. The established Castellamarese community in Brooklyn had by the early 1900s already begun consolidating its own criminal operations under leadership drawn directly from that same hometown network. Men who understood instinctively that they could trust each other in a way they would never fully trust an outsider, regardless of how many years that outsider had spent proving himself inside the American underworld. The man who would eventually mentor young Joseph Bonanno into the highest levels of this criminal world was Salvatore Maranzano, another figure connected to the broader Castellamarese network, who arrived in America during this same general period and quickly established himself as one of the most capable and ambitious leaders within that specific community. Maranzano possessed genuine intellectual ambitions that set him apart from many of his criminal contemporaries, having reportedly studied for the priesthood at one point in his life, and maintaining a lifelong fascination with the ancient Roman Empire, a fascination that would eventually shape the very structure he tried to impose on the entire American underworld once he finally achieved the position he had spent years working toward. By the late 1920s, the tension building between the established Castellamarese network and the rival organization controlled by a boss named Giuseppe Masseria, known throughout the underworld simply as Joe the Boss, had grown severe enough that both sides understood a genuine conflict was becoming almost impossible to avoid. Masseria represented an older, more established power structure within New York's Italian-American criminal world, and he had grown increasingly determined to bring the independent-minded Castellamarese network fully under his own direct control, treating their continued autonomy as an intolerable challenge to his own claimed authority over the entire city's underworld. The Castellamarese families, for their part, had no intention whatsoever of surrendering the independence and internal cohesion that had defined their specific community since long before any of them had ever set foot in America. This underlying tension finally exploded into open, sustained warfare in 1930, in a conflict that history would eventually remember as the Castellamarese War, a struggle that would consume the following 2 years and ultimately reshape the entire structure of organized crime across the city, and by extension, across the entire country. Maranzano emerged as the acknowledged leader of the Castellamarese faction during this conflict, coordinating the war effort against Masseria's forces with the same kind of careful, strategic thinking that had characterized his approach to criminal leadership more broadly, drawing directly, according to accounts of his own personal interests, on lessons he had absorbed from his lifelong study of ancient Roman military and political organization. Joseph Bonanno, still in his mid-20s during this period, fought alongside Maranzano throughout the entire conflict, absorbing an education in leadership, strategy, and the particular brand of calculated ruthlessness this world demanded that would prove immensely valuable once his own turn eventually came to lead an organization of his own. The war ground on with escalating violence on both sides, killings and counter-killings piling up as the two factions fought for dominance over territory, criminal proceeds, and ultimately, the entire question of who would control organized crime across the largest and most lucrative city in the country. The turning point arrived on April 15, 1931, when Giuseppe Masseria was shot and killed while eating lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island, a killing carried out, according to multiple historical accounts, by men working on behalf of one of Masseria's own trusted lieutenants, a young, ambitious operator named Charles Luciano, who had quietly concluded that his own future depended on abandoning the losing side of this specific war before it destroyed him along with his boss. This detail deserves particular attention here, early in an account that will spend considerable time examining the Bonanno family's own history, because it establishes a pattern that this account has traced repeatedly across other criminal organizations examined in earlier work, and that pattern would eventually return with devastating consequences directly inside the Bonanno family itself decades later. Even the very war that gave birth to this specific criminal lineage was decided, in its final and most consequential moment, by a trusted subordinate deciding that his own survival mattered more than his continued loyalty to the boss he had served. With Masseria dead, the Castellamarese faction had effectively won the war, and Salvatore Maranzano moved quickly to consolidate the victory into a formal, lasting structure for the entire New York underworld going forward. He convened a massive gathering of Italian-American criminal figures from across the city and declared himself the boss of bosses, a title meant to establish permanent, unquestioned authority over every other organized crime family operating anywhere within the metropolitan area. Maranzano then divided New York's criminal underworld into 5 formally recognized families, each controlling its own specific territory and operations, while nominally answering to Maranzano's own supreme authority, an organizational structure that, in its basic 5-family shape, would remain recognizable for the following century of American organized crime history. Bonanno, still only 26 years old, received command of one of these 5 families as a direct reward for his loyalty and his contributions throughout the war Maranzano had just won. This made him, by a considerable margin, the youngest boss among the 5 men now formally recognized as controlling New York's entire organized crime landscape, a position that reflected both the genuine trust Maranzano had developed in his young protege and the sheer scale of opportunity that had suddenly opened up for anyone positioned correctly in the immediate aftermath of Masseria's death. What Bonanno inherited that year was considerably more than simple territorial control over a specific slice of New York's underworld. He inherited an organization built directly on the specific cultural inheritance of Castellammare del Golfo itself, a family in the most literal sense available to this world, composed overwhelmingly of men connected by blood, marriage, or shared hometown origin to the same small Sicilian fishing village that had shaped Bonanno's own childhood. This foundation would define the organization's particular character for decades to come, a group that prided itself on an insularity and a blood-based loyalty considerably deeper than what many of the other 4 New York families could genuinely claim. Families built more loosely around shared criminal opportunity than around the kind of generational, hometown-connected trust that ran through the Bonanno organization from its very first day. That insularity, that specific pride in tight, blood-bound loyalty, tracing directly back to a single Sicilian town, would eventually become one of the defining features separating the Bonanno family's history from every other organization examined across the broader history of American organized crime. It gave the family a genuine cohesion and resilience that helped it survive challenges other families might not have weathered nearly so well. It also, as this account will trace across the sections that follow, created exactly the kind of intense, personal, blood-deep sense of betrayal whenever that specific loyalty was eventually broken from within. A betrayal that would occur not once, but repeatedly across the following decades, each time landing with a particular, devastating weight, precisely because the family had always understood itself as something considerably closer to an actual family than almost any other organization this history has ever examined. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A war decided by one man's calculated betrayal gave a 26-year-old command of an entire criminal family built on blood and hometown loyalty. The next section follows what happened once the man who had given him that family turned his ambition toward ruling everyone else, and discovered exactly how quickly his own students could turn against him. Section 2. The Boss of Bosses, who lasted 5 months. Salvatore Maranzano had studied the Roman Empire closely enough to know exactly what he wanted his own new order to look like, and for a few months in the summer of 1931, It must have genuinely felt to him like he had actually built it. He had won the war. He had killed the man who stood in his way. He had gathered the entire New York underworld together and declared himself boss of bosses, a title that placed him, at least in his own understanding of the new arrangement, above every other family leader in the city, including the very men he had just spent 2 years fighting alongside to win that war in the first place. What Maranzano failed to fully appreciate, in the flush of victory, was that the very men he had trained to think strategically, to plan patiently, and to strike decisively when the moment called for it, had learned those lessons well enough to eventually turn them directly against the man who had taught them. The new structure Maranzano imposed on New York's underworld went considerably further than simply dividing the city into 5 families. He established an elaborate, almost ceremonial hierarchy within each family, positions with titles borrowed directly from his own study of ancient Rome, and he insisted on a level of personal deference and tribute that many of the younger, more Americanized criminals coming up through this world found increasingly difficult to stomach. Maranzano demanded that family bosses pay him substantial sums of money as a form of tribute recognizing his supreme authority, and he began positioning himself less as a first among equals overseeing a cooperative arrangement between independent families, and more as a genuine emperor ruling over subordinate territories that existed largely to serve his own personal enrichment and glory. Among the men who had fought loyally on Maranzano's side throughout the entire Castellamarese War was Charles Luciano, the very operator whose calculated betrayal of his own boss, Giuseppe Masseria, had actually decided the war's final outcome. Luciano had switched sides specifically because he judged, correctly, that Masseria's continued leadership offered him a worse future than defecting to the winning side while there was still time to benefit from the switch. This calculation had served Luciano extraordinarily well throughout the war itself, earning him a position of genuine trust, and standing within the newly reorganized underworld Maranzano had just finished building. What Luciano discovered within only a few months of Maranzano's declared victory was that the new boss of bosses intended to treat him, and every other family leader across the city, with exactly the kind of domineering, tribute-demanding authority that made genuine long-term cooperation increasingly untenable. Luciano had not spent years fighting through a brutal, costly war against one overbearing boss, simply to install another overbearing boss in his place, one whose demands for tribute and deference seemed, if anything, considerably more extensive than anything Masseria himself had ever attempted to impose. Accounts of this period consistently describe growing resentment among several of the younger, more business-minded criminal leaders across the city, men who had absorbed considerably more of an American, transactional approach to organized crime than Maranzano's own elaborate, almost feudal vision of hierarchical tribute and ceremonial deference. Where Maranzano wanted a genuine empire, with himself seated permanently at its head, men like Luciano wanted something closer to a functioning business partnership between independent operators, an arrangement where power could shift according to actual capability and opportunity rather than remaining permanently fixed beneath a single supreme authority who had simply happened to win the most recent war. Maranzano, for his part, appears to have sensed this growing resistance developing beneath the surface of his newly declared order, and rather than attempting to negotiate or accommodate the concerns building among his own subordinate bosses, he began planning a preemptive strike meant to eliminate the men he viewed as the greatest emerging threats to his continued supremacy. According to multiple historical accounts of this period, Maranzano drew up a list of significant underworld figures he intended to have killed, a list that reportedly included Luciano himself, along with several of Luciano's closest allies, a plan apparently motivated by Maranzano's own growing paranoia that these younger, more independent-minded operators represented an existential threat to the entire structure he had just spent the Castellamarese War building. What Maranzano failed to account for was that his own plans leaked, whether through a compromised associate or simple carelessness in how widely he discussed his intentions, reaching Luciano and his allies before Maranzano could actually put the plan into motion against them. Luciano, having already demonstrated once, through his role in Masseria's own death, exactly how decisively he was willing to act once he concluded that striking first represented his only realistic path to survival, moved immediately once he understood what Maranzano intended for him. On September 10, 1931, only months after Maranzano had declared himself supreme leader of the entire New York underworld. A group of men posing as government agents arrived at Maranzano's office in Midtown Manhattan. Accounts of the killing describe the men producing badges and identification that convinced Maranzano's own bodyguards to step aside, believing an official government raid was underway, rather than an assassination in progress. Once inside, the attackers turned on Maranzano directly, killing him in his own office in a killing that, whatever its precise details, ended the reign of the boss of bosses less than half a year after he had first claimed that title in front of the entire assembled underworld. Luciano moved quickly in the aftermath of Maranzano's death to prevent exactly the kind of destructive, prolonged power struggle that had already consumed the city for the previous 2 years during the Castellamarese War itself. Rather than attempting to install himself as a new supreme boss of bosses, repeating the exact model that had just gotten Maranzano killed, Luciano proposed something considerably more sustainable: a governing council made up of the heads of the 5 recognized families, a body that would eventually become known simply as the Commission. This structure preserved the basic 5-family division Maranzano had originally established, but replaced his rigid, hierarchical vision of supreme personal authority with something closer to a cooperative arrangement between formally equal bosses, each maintaining independent control over his own family's territory and operations while working together through the Commission to resolve disputes and coordinate matters affecting the underworld as a whole. This moment matters enormously for understanding the entire subsequent history of the Bonanno family, because it placed young Joseph Bonanno, only 26 years old, and only months into his own leadership of the family that would eventually carry his name, directly in the middle of exactly the kind of sudden, violent leadership transition that would recur throughout the rest of his organization's history. Bonanno had fought loyally alongside Maranzano throughout the entire Castellamarese War, learning strategy and leadership directly from the very man Luciano's faction had just killed. He now found himself needing to navigate a relationship with the men responsible for that killing, understanding clearly that his own continued survival and his own family's continued standing within the newly reorganized underworld depended on accepting the new commission structure rather than attempting to avenge his former mentor's death, a path that would have almost certainly gotten him killed as well, given how thoroughly Luciano's faction had already demonstrated its willingness and capability to eliminate anyone standing in the way of the new arrangement. Bonanno, displaying exactly the kind of pragmatic, calculated judgment that would define much of his subsequent decades-long career, chose accommodation over vengeance. He accepted his position within the new commission structure, maintained his own family's independence and territorial control, and settled into what would become a genuinely long and, for many years, remarkably stable tenure as one of the 5 recognized bosses governing New York's organized crime landscape. This decision illustrates something important about how the specific culture Bonanno had inherited from Castellammare del Golfo actually operated in practice once real power and real danger were involved. The blood loyalty and hometown solidarity that defined his own family internally did not extend into some broader sentimental loyalty toward Maranzano himself, once Maranzano's continued survival had become a genuine threat to the wider stability of the underworld Bonanno now needed to operate within. Personal loyalty, however deeply felt, consistently gave way to practical calculation whenever the two came into direct conflict, a pattern that this account has already traced across other organizations, and one that would eventually return with particular force inside the Bonanno family's own internal history decades later. Over the following decades, Bonanno built his family into one of the more stable and successful organizations among the 5 now formally recognized under the Commission's governing structure. He expanded operations well beyond the family's original Brooklyn base, eventually building interests reaching from New York into Arizona, California, and Canada, a geographic reach that reflected both his own ambition and the particular advantage his organization held through its deep, ongoing connections back to Castellammare del Golfo itself. Connections that continued supplying the family with trusted, blood-related manpower directly from Sicily across multiple subsequent generations. Bonanno's own memoir, published decades later under the deliberately chosen title, A Man of Honor, reflects the particular self-image he maintained throughout his life, a boss who understood himself as operating according to genuine tradition and honor, however violently that tradition and honor were actually enforced in practice. What makes this early chapter of the family's history particularly worth examining alongside everything that follows across the rest of this account is how directly it establishes patterns that would repeat, again and again, across the following decades of Bonanno family history. A war decided by calculated betrayal gave the family its very existence. A supreme leader's overreaching ambition, and his own subordinates' willingness to strike first once they judged that ambition had become an existential threat, ended that leader's reign within months of its supposed triumph. And the young man who inherited leadership of what would become the Bonanno family survived his own dangerous early years, not through unwavering sentimental loyalty to the mentor who had raised him up, but through a cold, practical willingness to accept a new arrangement the moment the alternative became a genuine threat to his own continued survival. This foundation, laid across the war and its immediate violent aftermath, would echo across every subsequent chapter of the family's history examined in the sections still ahead. Joseph Bonanno himself would eventually face his own version of exactly the crisis that had claimed Maranzano, decades later, once his own ambitions grew large enough that the rest of the commission concluded he had become a threat requiring decisive action. The pattern established in the family's very first year of existence, ambition provoking betrayal, betrayal provoking violence, and violence eventually settling into whatever new arrangement allowed the underworld to keep functioning, would prove considerably more durable than any individual boss who ever tried to bend that pattern permanently in his own favor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Maranzano's own students killed him the moment his ambition outgrew what they were willing to tolerate, and the young boss he had trained learned exactly the right lesson from watching it happen. The next section follows that same young boss decades later, once his own ambition finally grew large enough that the commission he had helped create turned that identical lesson directly against him. Section 3. The boss who vanished from his own war. By 1963, Joseph Bonanno had spent more than 3 decades as one of the 5 men governing New York's organized crime landscape. Longer than almost any other boss who had ever sat on the commission he helped Charles Luciano build in the smoking ruins of Salvatore Maranzano's failed empire. He had watched Maranzano try to rule as a supreme emperor and get killed for the attempt within months. He understood, better than almost anyone else still active in this world, exactly what happened to a boss who reached for more power than the rest of the commission was willing to tolerate. And in 1963, at nearly 60 years old, after decades of exactly the kind of careful, patient leadership that had kept his own family stable while other organizations tore themselves apart, Joseph Bonanno decided to reach for exactly that kind of forbidden power anyway. The specific plan Bonanno developed involved a fellow boss named Joseph Magliocco, who led the family that had originally been built by Joseph Profaci before Profaci's death left Magliocco as his successor. Bonanno and Magliocco together drew up a scheme to assassinate several rival bosses sitting on the commission, men whose removal would have dramatically shifted the balance of power across the entire city's underworld in favor of the 2 conspirators. This was, in almost every structural sense, exactly the kind of move that had destroyed Maranzano 3 decades earlier. An attempt by ambitious men to seize disproportionate control over an underworld that had spent 30 years operating according to a cooperative, power-sharing arrangement specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous consolidation. Magliocco assigned the actual killing contract to one of his own top operators, a man named Joseph Colombo, whose own subsequent career and eventual assassination this account has examined in earlier work covering a different aspect of organized crime history. Colombo, rather than simply carrying out the assignment as instructed, made a decision that would prove immediately and permanently consequential. He revealed the entire plot directly to the men it had been designed to kill, choosing to protect his own long-term position by exposing the conspiracy, rather than risk the enormous retaliation that would inevitably follow once a plot of this scale against the commission itself was eventually discovered, as these things almost always eventually were within a world this deeply infiltrated by its own internal informants and shifting loyalties. The commission, upon learning that 2 of its own 5 bosses had conspired to assassinate several of their fellow members, moved with the kind of swift, decisive judgment this account has already traced in its examination of exactly how this governing body had originally come into existence in the first place. Magliocco was spared execution, largely because of his advanced age and failing health, but was forced into permanent retirement from any position of criminal leadership, effectively ending his career and his family's independent standing in a single stroke. Bonanno, facing considerably more serious consequences, given his own direct role in originating the plot, fled the country entirely, making his way to Canada rather than remain within reach of a commission that had every reason to view him as having forfeited any claim to the protection and respect his decades of prior service might otherwise have earned him. This flight to Canada marks the beginning of what would become, across the following several years, one of the strangest and most genuinely bizarre chapters in the entire history of American organized crime. A conflict that the press eventually nicknamed the Bonanno War, drawing directly on Bonanno's own increasingly famous nickname, Joe Bananas, a name that had attached itself to him years earlier, and that sat, by this point in his career, in genuinely uncomfortable tension with the deadly seriousness of the events now unfolding around him. Bonanno briefly returned to New York in 1964, understanding that he would need to appear before a grand jury investigating organized crime activity, a legal obligation he could not indefinitely avoid without risking even more serious consequences than the ones already accumulating against him following the exposed assassination plot. On the evening of October 20th, 1964, Bonanno sat down to dinner at an uptown Manhattan restaurant with 3 of his own attorneys, preparing for his scheduled grand jury appearance the following day. What happened next depends considerably on which account a person chooses to believe, and this uncertainty itself deserves careful attention, because it illustrates something distinctive about Bonanno's own particular character, compared to almost every other boss examined across the broader history of organized crime this channel has traced. According to the official story Bonanno himself maintained for the rest of his life, he was kidnapped that night on Park Avenue by 2 armed men, one of whom he later claimed was his own cousin, Stefano Magaddino, the Buffalo-based boss who had fled to that city decades earlier to escape murder charges connected to the family's earliest years in America. Bonanno claimed he was held for months in a secluded location before eventually being released, resurfacing publicly only in May 1966, roughly 19 months after his initial disappearance, only to quickly vanish from public view once again, before finally cooperating fully with authorities. A considerably different account, advanced by multiple mob historians and journalists who have studied the case closely in the decades since, holds that the entire kidnapping was an elaborate hoax, staged by Bonanno himself, specifically to avoid testifying before the grand jury the following morning, and to buy himself time to maneuver against the commission's punishment, while avoiding any legal obligation to answer questions under oath about exactly what he and Magliocco had actually planned. Whatever the genuine truth behind Bonanno's disappearance, and the ambiguity itself, has never been definitively resolved even decades later, the practical effect on his own organization back in New York proved immediate and genuinely destructive. With Bonanno gone, whether through actual kidnapping or self-imposed strategic disappearance, leadership of the family fell to his own son, Salvatore Bonanno, known throughout his life by the nickname Bill. Joseph Bonanno had, in the months before his disappearance, maneuvered his son into the position of consigliere, one of the most senior advisory roles within the family's formal hierarchy, a promotion that bypassed considerably more experienced, harder-edged soldiers who had spent years proving their own value through exactly the kind of violent, practical work the elder Bonanno's own son had never personally performed. Bill Bonanno represented something genuinely unusual within this specific criminal culture. Clean-shaven, educated at an elite university, more comfortable discussing ideology and strategy than performing the actual violent labor that had built his father's organization from the ground up decades earlier. This nepotistic promotion, installing an inexperienced, considerably softer heir into a position of real authority while his father remained unreachable, created exactly the kind of resentment among the family's harder, more established soldiers that this account has already traced, destroying other criminal organizations examined in earlier sections. A veteran soldier named Gaspar de Gregorio, a man whose entire career had been built on exactly the kind of practical, violent competence Bill Bonanno so visibly lacked, took advantage of this growing discontent to claim leadership of the family for himself during Joseph Bonanno's extended absence. The commission, having already concluded that Joseph Bonanno had forfeited any legitimate claim to continued leadership through his own reckless assassination plot, formally recognized Di Gregorio as the family's new boss, a decision that split the entire organization into two openly warring factions: soldiers loyal to the Bonanno bloodline on one side, and soldiers loyal to Di Gregorio and the commission's own preferred alternative on the other. The following years produced a conflict that combined genuine, lethal violence with moments of almost theatrical strangeness that set the Bonanno War apart from many of the more straightforwardly brutal conflicts examined elsewhere across this broader history of organized crime. In early 1966, Di Gregorio reportedly proposed a peace meeting to Bill Bonanno, who agreed and suggested his own great-uncle's house on Troutman Street in Brooklyn as the meeting location, a suggestion that, given everything this account has already traced about how frequently supposed peace meetings within this specific criminal culture actually functioned as elaborate ambushes, should have raised considerably more suspicion among the men agreeing to attend than it apparently did in practice. Joseph Bonanno himself finally resurfaced from his extended disappearance in May 1966, reappearing briefly before dropping out of public view once again almost immediately afterward, a pattern of appearance and disappearance that only deepened the general uncertainty surrounding his true circumstances and his actual strategic intentions throughout this entire period. The commission, growing increasingly frustrated with Di Gregorio's inability to decisively crush the remaining Bonanno loyalists, despite having the commission's own formal backing, eventually replaced him with another figure named Paul Sciacca, hoping fresh leadership might finally accomplish what Di Gregorio's faction had failed to achieve across the preceding years of ongoing, grinding conflict. The fighting itself, while never approaching the sheer scale of violence examined in this account's earlier coverage of the Sicilian Mafia's later wars against the Italian state, still produced genuine, serious bloodshed across New York's own underworld. 3 of Sciacca's men were killed by machine gun fire inside a Queens restaurant in one particularly notable episode of the conflict, and the fighting escalated further from there, with each side eventually losing additional men as the war ground on, without producing any clean, decisive resolution in either direction. Federal investigators, meanwhile, maintained a genuinely detailed and sophisticated understanding of exactly how this entire conflict was unfolding, drawing on both electronic surveillance planted in various mob hangouts and, more significantly, on direct intelligence provided by an informant embedded close enough to the situation to report accurately on which soldiers remained loyal to which faction and how negotiations between the two sides were actually progressing behind the scenes. This informant, according to later historical analysis of declassified FBI records, was Bill Bonanno himself, a detail that, if accurate, adds a genuinely remarkable layer of complexity to an already strange chapter of family history, suggesting that even as Bill Bonanno fought to preserve his father's legacy and his own inherited position within the organization, he was simultaneously providing federal authorities with information about the very conflict he was supposedly fighting to win. Joseph Bonanno's own recorded comments to federal agents during this period, as documented in subsequent historical accounts, reveal a man who understood with genuine clarity exactly how far his own standing had fallen from the position of respect and authority he had once commanded across more than 3 decades atop his own criminal family. He reportedly told investigators that his own soft-hearted refusal to crush the rebel faction decisively at the earliest opportunity, choosing instead to pursue a negotiated settlement rather than immediate, overwhelming violence, had proven to be his own undoing. In one particularly striking exchange, Bonanno reportedly told federal agents, with what reads across the historical record as genuine weary resignation, that his own diminished circumstances meant they need no longer bother paying him such close attention, observing bitterly that he and his organization had become essentially irrelevant within the broader underworld he had once helped govern. The conflict finally reached its practical conclusion in 1968, when Bonanno suffered a serious heart attack and flew to Arizona, where he formally informed the commission that he was retiring permanently from active leadership, a retirement that, unlike his earlier disappearance, appears to have been genuine rather than any further strategic maneuvering. The commission, understandably wary of trusting anything Bonanno said or did given the entire history of the preceding several years, nonetheless accepted this retirement as the fighting itself gradually diminished, and the badly divided, exhausted family eventually settled into accepting Shaka's continued leadership, a leadership that would itself pass through several subsequent successors before the organization finally found its way toward the considerably more stable, if ultimately far more consequential, leadership examined across the remainder of this account. What the Bonanno War actually demonstrated, considered alongside everything this account has already traced about the family's earliest origins, was that the specific pattern established during the Castellamarese War and Maranzano's own swift downfall had lost none of its essential force across more than 3 decades of subsequent history. A boss's ambition, reaching beyond what the broader governing structure was willing to tolerate, produced exactly the kind of internal fracturing and violent factional conflict that had already destroyed Maranzano's own brief reign as supreme leader decades earlier. Joseph Bonanno had watched that exact pattern unfold as a young man fighting at Maranzano's side. He had evidently absorbed considerably less from that experience than his own decades of subsequent success might have suggested, reaching for exactly the kind of forbidden, disproportionate power that had already proven fatal once before within this specific criminal world, and discovering, across 4 years of internal warfare that nearly destroyed the family bearing his own name, exactly how completely that same pattern was prepared to repeat itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bonanno survived his own war, but the family he left behind spent the following decade proving it had learned nothing about avoiding exactly the kind of dangerous overreach that had nearly destroyed it. The next section follows the boss who inherited that fractured organization, and the return of a familiar name from an earlier chapter of this account, a man determined to seize total control regardless of what the commission actually approved. Section 4. The boss who ruled from a cell. By the early 1970s, the family Joseph Bonanno had built and then nearly destroyed through his own reckless ambition had passed into the hands of a man whose entire career would be defined by a genuinely strange contradiction. A boss who spent more than half his adult life locked inside a prison cell, and who somehow still managed to hold formal, commission-recognized authority over an entire organized crime family for the better part of 2 decades. Philip Rastelli, born Filippo Rastelli in the Maspeth section of Queens, earned his nickname Rusty through exactly the pattern that would define his entire reign: repeated imprisonment that kept him physically separated from his own organization for years at a stretch, forcing him to govern an empire he could rarely actually see or touch with his own hands. He had risen through the family's ranks the ordinary way, working his way up through loan sharking and other street-level rackets, absorbing the family's operational culture from the ground floor, rather than inheriting any particular advantage of bloodline or hometown pedigree, the way Joseph Bonanno himself had once carried directly from Castellammare del Golfo. Rastelli represented something genuinely new within the specific history this account has traced so far. Every previous boss examined across the earlier sections of this history, Maranzano, Bonanno himself, had come up through the family's original Brooklyn base, deeply embedded within the Castellamarese network that had defined the organization's founding culture. Rastelli came from Queens, the first leader of the family drawn from a different geographic faction entirely, a detail that mattered considerably for understanding the internal tensions that would eventually consume much of his own tenure as boss. Men whose entire criminal identity traced back to the same small Sicilian fishing village had spent decades assuming that a Brooklyn-based Castellamarese leadership represented the natural and permanent order of things within their own organization, and Rastelli's rise to formal authority represented, quietly, the first genuine break from that founding geographic pattern in the family's entire history. On February 23, 1974, at a meeting held at the Americana Hotel in Manhattan, the commission formally named Rastelli as the new boss of the Bonanno family, recognizing him as the legitimate successor to the leadership chain.
8 in the evening, November 1st, 2025.
Years since Joseph Bonanno's own forced retirement to Arizona. This formal recognition, however, carried considerably less practical weight than it might have carried for any of Rastelli's predecessors, precisely because of a specific complication that would come to define the entirety of his subsequent tenure as boss. What the commission's formal endorsement failed to account for was the return, at almost exactly this same moment, of a man whose earlier career this broader history of organized crime has already examined in considerable detail through a different lens entirely. Carmine Galante, released from federal prison in 1974 after serving roughly a decade on narcotics trafficking charges, walked out of Lewisburg Penitentiary, convinced that he, rather than Rastelli, represented the family's rightful and legitimate leader, a conviction rooted in his own decades of loyal service to Joseph Bonanno personally, going back to the very earliest years of the family's founding in New York. Galante had spent his career building deep, personal connections directly to Sicily itself, cultivating relationships that ran considerably closer to the actual old country criminal networks than almost any other American-based mafioso of his generation had managed to establish, including a notable meeting Joseph Bonanno himself had chaired back in 1957 at the Grand Hotel de Palm in Palermo, a gathering that had brought together Sicilian-American mobsters and their counterparts still operating on the island itself, and that Galante had personally attended as one of Bonanno's own trusted lieutenants. This history mattered enormously for how Galante understood his own claim to leadership once he finally regained his freedom. He had not spent his decade in prison believing his own influence within the organization had somehow diminished. If anything, his continued connections to the old country criminal networks, sustained even from behind prison walls through correspondence and visits from trusted associates, had only deepened during the years Rastelli spent building his own, considerably more provisional claim to formal commission recognition. Galante viewed Rastelli's installation as boss, not as a legitimate transfer of authority, reflecting the organization's genuine consensus, but as a kind of temporary administrative arrangement that would obviously dissolve the moment a more deserving and more capable leader became available to reclaim his rightful position. Real power within the Bonanno organization, despite the commission's formal recognition of Rastelli's authority, migrated rapidly toward Galante once he regained his freedom, a shift driven substantially by Galante's personal willingness to use violence and intimidation in ways that quickly established him as the organization's genuine operational leader regardless of what title the commission had officially bestowed elsewhere. Soldiers and captains across the family found themselves navigating an increasingly uncomfortable reality, a boss recognized by the commission who remained physically absent for long stretches, and a considerably more visible, the considerably more forceful rival, operating in plain sight, who appeared genuinely unconcerned about whatever formal consequences his open defiance of Rastelli's authority might eventually bring down on him. On March 6, 1975, only a year after his own formal installation as boss, Rastelli found himself indicted on racketeering charges connected to extortion, an indictment that sent him back to prison and left the field almost entirely open for Galante to consolidate the practical control over the family's actual day-to-day operations that his own personal force of will had already begun securing in Rastelli's continued absence. This particular timing deserves attention because it meant Rastelli's own formal authority, barely established, immediately returned to exactly the same kind of distant, mediated governance that had already come to define his predecessor's final years leading the organization. A pattern of imprisonment interrupting leadership that this account has now traced across multiple consecutive Bonanno bosses, spanning more than a decade of the family's history. With Rastelli once again removed from active leadership through imprisonment, Galante seized outright control of the Bonanno family as its unofficial acting boss, and he used that control to push the organization deeper into international heroin trafficking than any previous Bonanno leadership had ever attempted. This expansion into narcotics represented a genuinely significant departure from the family's earlier operational priorities, which had traditionally centered more heavily on gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering, activities that carried somewhat less legal exposure and considerably less potential for the kind of catastrophic federal attention that drug trafficking convictions tended to attract. Galante, driven by both genuine ambition and by connections that ran unusually deep into the actual international supply chains feeding heroin from the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia into American cities, pursued this expansion with a single-mindedness that alarmed even some of his own closest associates. To protect this newly aggressive drug empire, and to protect his own person against exactly the kind of internal challenge this account has already traced repeatedly destroying other ambitious organized crime figures, Galante began importing young men directly from his own ancestral region in Sicily, men with no prior connections to the existing American underworld, who owed their entire criminal careers and their entire presence in the country to Galante's own personal decision to bring them across the ocean. American mobsters gave these newcomers a mocking nickname, calling them Zips, a term derived from the rapid, unfamiliar cadence of their spoken Sicilian dialect, and while many established wise guys across the city's other families viewed these imported Sicilians with genuine suspicion and contempt, disliking their insularity and their reluctance to fully assimilate into the American organization's existing culture and customs, Galante trusted them completely, believing that men who owed him everything would never turn against the man who had given them their entire new life in America. This arrangement would prove to be one of the most consequential misjudgments in the family's entire history, though understanding exactly why requires appreciating something this account has already traced in earlier work examining Galante's career from a different angle entirely. The Zips Galante had imported specifically because he believed shared Sicilian origin created an unbreakable bond of personal loyalty, actually maintained their deepest and most genuine loyalty not to Galante personally, but to their own kin networks back in Sicily itself, and to the international heroin trafficking enterprise those networks were quietly building through channels that ran considerably beyond anything Galante himself fully controlled or even completely understood. Many of these imported Sicilians had in fact already been formally initiated as made men back in Sicily before ever setting foot in America. A cross-affiliation between the American and Sicilian branches of this broader criminal tradition that created exactly the kind of confused, divided loyalty this specific chapter of the family's history would eventually make devastatingly clear, and that the American organization would eventually declare forbidden once the consequences of tolerating it had become impossible to ignore. By 1979, Galante's aggressive expansion into narcotics, combined with his outright dismissal of Rastelli's continuing formal authority, even while Rastelli remained officially recognized by the Commission as the family's legitimate boss, had alarmed leadership across every other major New York crime family, not merely within the Bonanno organization itself. The other bosses watched Galante's brazen attempt to seize personal control over the entire city's narcotics trade with growing unease, understanding that his continued, unchecked expansion threatened to upset a balance of power and profit-sharing that had taken decades to stabilize following the earlier internal wars this account has already examined. There was, beyond the immediate practical concern over narcotics profits and territory, a deeper institutional anxiety at work as well. A recognition that Galante's open defiance of Rastelli's commission-sanctioned authority represented exactly the kind of precedent that could unravel the entire cooperative structure Charles Luciano had established decades earlier in the aftermath of Maranzano's own death. If other ambitious captains across other families concluded that formal commission recognition no longer carried any genuine enforceable weight, Frank Thierry, boss of the Genovese family, began quietly building consensus among the other commission bosses for Galante's removal, a campaign that eventually secured formal approval even from Joseph Bonanno himself, the retired founder whose own name the family still carried, and who apparently harbored no particular sentimental attachment toward preserving the career of a man who had once served him loyally for decades, once that man's continued survival had come to threaten the wider stability of an underworld arrangement Bonanno himself had helped build, and had spent his own final active years trying, unsuccessfully, to bend in his own favor. This detail deserves particular attention because it illustrates with unusual clarity exactly how little genuine, lasting sentiment actually governed relationships within this specific criminal culture, once practical necessity pointed in a different direction. Galante had served Bonanno faithfully for decades, going back to the family's earliest years. That service bought him nothing once the Commission's collective judgment turned against him. Rastelli, still imprisoned but maintaining active contact with the family through trusted associates on the street, sought and received the Commission's formal approval to have Galante killed, working through a Bonanno captain named Joseph Massino, a name that will return with considerably greater significance across the remaining sections of this account, to actually coordinate the details of how the killing would be carried out. Rastelli's two most important operational contacts within the organization during this period were Massino himself and another rising captain named Dominic Napolitano, known throughout the underworld by the nickname Sonny Black, a man whose own subsequent story this account will examine in considerably greater depth in the sections still ahead. Both men understood that successfully removing Galante would not only secure Rastelli's own continued authority, but would also, quite directly, establish their own standing as the family's most capable and most trusted operational leaders going forward, a calculation that ran alongside whatever genuine loyalty either man felt toward Rastelli himself. On July 12, 1979, Carmine Galante sat down for lunch on the open patio of a restaurant in Brooklyn's Bushwick section, accompanied by his two personal Sicilian bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesare Bonventre, men Galante had brought over from Sicily, specifically because he believed their imported, blood-tied loyalty made them the most trustworthy protection available to him anywhere in his entire organization. Gunmen wearing masks approached the patio and opened fire, killing Galante instantly, along with two other men seated at the table with him. Amato and Bonventre, the two bodyguards specifically chosen for their supposedly unbreakable personal loyalty, fled the scene entirely unharmed, having either stepped clear at precisely the right moment, or, according to the most widely credited accounts examining the killing afterward, having actively participated in arranging the very ambush that killed the man who had personally brought them across an entire ocean and given them their whole criminal careers in America. With Galante finally out of the picture, Rastelli emerged, at least on paper, as the family's clear and uncontested boss, having successfully outmaneuvered the one figure who had spent years actively challenging his formal authority. In practice, Rastelli's continued imprisonment meant that genuine operational control over the family's day-to-day affairs remained concentrated in the hands of the very men who had actually carried out the plot against Galante, particularly Massino and Napolitano, the two capable, ambitious captains whose growing influence and street-level authority would soon create exactly the kind of internal tension this account has already traced destroying multiple previous leadership arrangements across the family's entire history. What makes this specific chapter of the family's history particularly worth setting alongside everything examined in earlier sections of this account is how directly it demonstrates the same underlying pattern operating yet again, this time compressed into a considerably shorter time frame than the decades-long Bonanno War that had preceded it. A boss reaches for power beyond what the Commission and his own organization's leadership structure is willing to formally sanction. That overreach eventually produces a coordinated response from the very men whose cooperation the ambitious boss actually needs to survive. And the specific instrument of that response, in this particular case, was drawn directly from the very source of supposedly unbreakable personal loyalty the overreaching boss had most trusted to protect him, Sicilian bodyguards imported specifically because shared blood and shared origin were supposed to guarantee a devotion no ordinary American soldier could ever match. Galante had learned nothing from watching Joseph Bonanno's own earlier downfall play out across the Bonanno War only a decade before his own release from prison, or perhaps he had learned exactly the wrong lesson entirely, concluding that Bonanno's failure had stemmed from insufficient personal control over his own organization's manpower, rather than from the more fundamental problem of reaching for power the wider commission structure was never going to tolerate, regardless of how loyal any individual boss's personal soldiers actually turned out to be. Rastelli, watching from behind prison walls as his own rival was eliminated by men working under his own distant direction, absorbed a considerably more useful lesson from the same sequence of events, one that would define the considerably more careful, patient approach to leadership his own eventual successor would take, directly from watching exactly how the Galante situation had actually been resolved. That successor was already, by the time Galante's body was found on that restaurant patio, quietly building exactly the kind of operational authority and personal relationships that would make him the single most important figure within the family's practical, day-to-day leadership for the following quarter century, a rise this account will trace in considerably greater detail across the sections still ahead, once the specific costs of the Galante killing had fully worked their way through the rest of the organization's fractured, competing factions. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rastelli survived by letting other men do the actual killing, while he remained safely behind prison walls, a lesson his own most capable captain absorbed with particular care. The next section follows that captain directly into a friendship with a man who was not at all who he claimed to be, and the years of trust that friendship quietly consumed before anyone within the family understood what was actually happening. Section 5. The Man Who Watched Cartoons. With an FBI agent, Carmine Galante's death in the summer of 1979 solved one problem for Philip Rastelli and created several new ones almost immediately. The 3 Sicilian bodyguards and captains who had helped arrange Galante's killing expected to be rewarded for their service, and Rastelli, still governing from behind prison walls, needed those same men to remain loyal to him rather than deciding, as ambitious men within this family had already decided more than once across the preceding decades, that the moment had come to seize control for themselves instead. Among the men who had helped remove Galante, and now stood to benefit most from his absence, was a Brooklyn captain named Dominic Napolitano, known throughout the underworld as Sonny Black, a nickname earned from the hair dye he used to darken his naturally silver hair. Napolitano had risen to prominence as a soldier under a capo named Michael Sabella before being promoted to captain himself, replacing his own mentor in the reshuffling that followed Galante's execution. He was, by every account of the period, a genuinely respected and capable figure within the family's Brooklyn faction, trusted enough that Rastelli's loyalists relied on him as one of their 2 most important contacts on the street during the years the boss himself remained locked away. Napolitano carried himself with the kind of confident, easy authority that made other soldiers within his own crew genuinely comfortable following his lead, and accounts of his character from this period consistently describe him as personable and generous in ways that set him apart somewhat from the colder, more purely calculating reputation many other captains within the organization had built for themselves across the years. This account has already examined. He cared for pigeons as a personal hobby, kept close friendships within his own neighborhood that extended beyond purely criminal business, and projected an image, at least to those who knew him casually, of a man comfortable enough in his own position that he had little need to prove his toughness through constant, visible aggression the way some of his more insecure contemporaries felt compelled to do. This particular quality of personal warmth, this account will demonstrate across the remainder of this section, proved to be both the foundation of his rise within the organization and, ultimately, the specific vulnerability that would cost him his life. Napolitano's own downfall, and the downfall of 2 other captains who would die months later in events this account has already examined, began with a decision that seemed, at the time he made it, like nothing more than ordinary business, extending trust to a promising associate who claimed to want nothing more than to prove himself worthy of eventual membership in the family. In September 1976, a man calling himself Donnie Brasco had begun working his way into the lower ranks of New York's organized crime world, initially building connections within elements of the Colombo crime family through a Bonanno soldier named Anthony Mira, before eventually finding his way into Napolitano's own orbit within the Bonanno organization itself. Brasco presented himself as a jewel thief, tough-talking, capable, exactly the kind of ambitious, criminally skilled associate that any capo looking to build his own crew's strength would have been genuinely pleased to discover. Brasco was not, in fact, a jewel thief at all. His real name was Joseph Pistone, and he was an FBI special agent who had been working this exact undercover assignment since 1976, building his cover identity with a patience and a commitment that would eventually make his specific infiltration one of the most consequential and most studied operations in the entire history of American law enforcement's efforts against organized crime. Pistone had originally been introduced into the Bonanno family's orbit through Mira, but it was his subsequent relationship with Napolitano that would prove most significant, both for the FBI's own intelligence gathering and for the eventual, devastating consequences that relationship would bring down on Napolitano himself. Pistone's own training and preparation for this specific assignment had involved years of careful study, learning to speak convincingly about jewel theft and burglary, absorbing the particular mannerisms, vocabulary, and unwritten rules of conduct that governed how an ambitious, credible criminal associate was actually expected to carry himself within this specific underworld culture. What makes Pistone's specific infiltration worth examining in genuine detail, rather than simply noting its existence as a plot point on the way toward the violence still to come, is how thoroughly and how personally Napolitano actually trusted the man he believed to be Donnie Brasco. This was not a distant, purely transactional relationship between a capo and a promising but ultimately expendable associate. Pistone spent enough time inside Napolitano's genuine daily life that he would sometimes sleep on Napolitano's own couch, and would watch cartoons with him in the mornings. Small, almost domestic details that illustrate exactly how completely Pistone had managed to embed himself within the actual texture of Napolitano's ordinary existence, rather than simply appearing at occasional business meetings and maintaining careful professional distance the rest of the time. The two men reportedly developed a genuine rapport that extended well beyond the specific criminal business that had originally brought them into contact, sharing meals together, discussing matters entirely unrelated to the family's operations, building exactly the kind of easy, familiar friendship that develops between two people who spend considerable time together over the course of several years, regardless of whatever hidden agenda one of them happens to be secretly carrying throughout the entire relationship. Napolitano trusted Brasco enough, eventually, to propose him for full membership within the Bonanno family itself, a genuinely serious step that would have made Brasco a formally made man, initiated into the organization through the same kind of ceremony and lifelong oath. This entire broader history of organized crime has traced repeatedly across other criminal cultures and other decades. This proposal represented the single clearest possible demonstration of exactly how completely Napolitano had come to trust the man he believed to be his own protege, because formal membership within this world was never extended casually or lightly. It required a sponsoring member willing to personally vouch for the recruit's character and loyalty, understanding that any subsequent betrayal by that recruit would reflect directly and severely on the sponsor's own judgment and standing within the organization. This relationship unfolded against the backdrop of a family already navigating exactly the kind of internal tension that had defined so much of its history since Joseph Bonanno's own downfall more than a decade earlier. Following Galante's death, the Bonanno organization split into competing factions, with different captains and their respective loyalists jockeying for position and influence within an organization whose actual boss remained physically absent, still serving out his prison sentence and governing, as best he could, through trusted intermediaries rather than direct personal presence. Napolitano found himself heading one significant faction within this fractured landscape, while a rival grouping formed around Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, whose own son Anthony, nicknamed Bruno, had been among the men who actually helped carry out the killing of Galante years earlier. The specific tension between these factions traced back, in considerable part, to unresolved questions about exactly how power and profit should be divided among the men who had helped remove Galante from the picture, and about who among the family's various capable captains actually deserved the greatest share of authority and respect going forward. Joseph Messino, the same captain who had helped coordinate the actual killing of Galante on Rastelli's behalf, emerged during this period as another genuinely significant power broker within the organization, maintaining close, direct contact with Rastelli, despite the boss's continued imprisonment, and building his own considerable influence over the family's practical, day-to-day operations, even while formally remaining only one captain among several competing for ultimate authority. This three-way tension between Napolitano's faction, the rebellious Indelicato grouping, and Messino's own, quietly expanding influence, would eventually produce the violence this account has already examined in an earlier section. Though at this specific point in the family's history, months before that violence actually erupted, the various factions remained locked in an uneasy, unresolved competition for genuine control. Napolitano's growing friendship with the man he believed to be Donnie Brasco unfolded entirely within this atmosphere of internal factional competition, a detail that would prove increasingly significant as circumstances developed. Napolitano assigned Brasco a specific and genuinely serious task in September 1981, instructing him to kill Bruno Indelicato, who had previously managed to survive an earlier attempt against the rebel faction his own father led within the organization. This assignment represented, in the clearest possible practical terms, exactly how completely Napolitano had come to trust the man he still believed was an ambitious, capable jewel thief, looking to prove his own value and earn his own path toward formal membership within the family. Handing an associate a genuine murder contract against a rival faction's own son represented a level of trust considerably beyond ordinary business association, placing Brasco directly at the center of the family's own internal power struggle in a way that, had he actually been the person he claimed to be, would have represented a genuine and significant step toward exactly the kind of formal membership Napolitano had already begun arranging on his behalf. What Napolitano did not know, and what would not become clear to him until it was already far too late to change the eventual outcome of his own story, was that Pistone's assignment as an undercover agent was ending at almost exactly this same moment. Shortly after Napolitano handed down the order to kill Indelicato, federal authorities made the decision to pull Pistone out of his undercover role entirely, concluding that his position had grown too dangerous to sustain any longer, and that the intelligence he had already gathered across nearly 6 years of patient, embedded work had reached the point of diminishing returns relative to the mounting personal risk he continued to face every single day he remained undercover. The specific timing of this extraction, arriving directly after Napolitano had assigned an actual killing contract, meant that federal handlers needed to move with genuine urgency, understanding that any further delay risked either exposing Pistone through his own inability to actually carry out the assigned murder, or forcing an impossible choice in which continuing the operation might require some form of complicity in violence the government could never actually permit. Once Pistone's assignment officially concluded, Napolitano was informed, through channels this account will trace in considerably greater detail across the sections still ahead, exactly who Donnie Brasco had actually been all along. The revelation that an FBI agent had spent nearly 6 years embedded so deeply within Napolitano's own crew that he had slept on the man's couch, watched cartoons in his living room, and very nearly become a formally made member of the family itself, represented a genuinely unprecedented breach within the specific culture of blood loyalty and hometown solidarity this account has traced back to the family's earliest origins in Castellammare del Golfo. This was not simply an ordinary informant, flipping under legal pressure, betraying men he had once genuinely served alongside, a pattern this broader history of organized crime has already examined repeatedly across multiple other organizations and multiple other decades. This was something considerably more unsettling from the perspective of everyone within the family who eventually learned what had actually happened. A complete stranger who had never belonged to this world at all, successfully manufacturing an entire false identity sustained across nearly 6 years of continuous, intimate, deeply personal deception. The scale of information Pistone had gathered across those 6 years, and had presumably reported back to federal handlers throughout the entire period, extended considerably beyond simple criminal activity connected directly to Napolitano's own crew. Pistone's position within the organization had granted him genuine insight into the family's broader internal politics, the specific factional tensions between Napolitano's own group and the rebellious Indelicato faction, the operational relationship connecting Massino and Rastelli despite the latter's continued imprisonment, and the general texture of how this particular criminal organization actually conducted its daily business across every level of its own internal hierarchy. This intelligence would eventually prove foundational to numerous subsequent prosecutions targeting the Bonanno family across the following decades, a legacy considerably more consequential than the specific fate of any single individual associate who happened to have trusted Brasco personally during the years of his undercover assignment. Several other mobsters within the Bonanno organization, once word finally spread that Brasco had actually been an undercover federal agent all along, reportedly refused at first to believe it, a detail that speaks directly to exactly how thoroughly and how convincingly Pistone had constructed his cover identity across the years he spent building it. This disbelief, however understandable given the sheer scale and duration of the deception involved, would not change the practical reality Napolitano now faced. He had proposed a federal agent for formal membership within the family. He had assigned that same federal agent an actual murder contract against a rival faction's own son. And he had, across years of genuine personal friendship built on cartoons and couches, and whatever else passes for ordinary domestic comfort, between two men who believe they trust each other completely, extended a level of intimate access to his own daily life that the organization's entire code of blood loyalty and hometown solidarity had never actually anticipated needing to guard against. The immediate practical consequence of this revelation would prove devastating for Napolitano personally, a consequence this account will trace directly in the section that follows. But the broader significance of Pistone's infiltration extends considerably further than simply explaining what eventually happened to the specific men who had trusted him. It illustrates something genuinely distinctive about exactly how vulnerable even a family built on generations of blood loyalty and careful insular hometown connection had actually become by the final decades of the 20th century, once federal law enforcement developed the patience, the resources, and the specific undercover methodology necessary to embed an outsider so completely within this world that the outsider's own false identity became, for years at a stretch, functionally indistinguishable from genuine, earned membership. There is a particular quality to this specific betrayal that separates it meaningfully from almost every other act of treachery this account has traced across the family's earlier history. And it deserves acknowledgement here before this account moves forward into the immediate, violent consequences that followed. Every previous betrayal examined across this history, Luciano's move against Masseria, the Commission's response to Maranzano's own overreach, Bonventre and Amato's calculated abandonment of Galante, involved men who genuinely belonged to this criminal world, weighing their own personal advantage within a system they fully understood and had voluntarily chosen to join. Pistone's betrayal operated according to an entirely different logic, a deception constructed from the very beginning for reasons that had nothing to do with personal advancement within organized crime, and everything to do with dismantling that world from a position of genuine, sustained intimacy that no ordinary member would ever have needed to construct so carefully in the first place. Napolitano had spent his entire adult life learning to recognize exactly the kind of calculated self-interest this account has traced, destroying so many other men across the family's history. He had no comparable framework for recognizing a friendship built entirely and patiently for the specific purpose of eventually destroying him, because nothing in the family's own culture of blood loyalty and hometown solidarity had ever prepared its members to guard against precisely that particular kind of threat. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Napolitano trusted a stranger enough to nearly make him family, never once suspecting the stranger belonged to the very government his entire world existed to evade. The next section follows what happened months earlier, before that stranger's true identity was ever revealed, when three of the family's own captains walked into a Brooklyn nightclub believing they were attending a peace meeting. Section 6. The meeting that was never about peace. On May 5, 1981, three capable, experienced captains within the Bonanno crime family made the same fatal mistake that had already claimed the lives of other men across the earlier decades this account has traced. Men who had watched, or should have watched closely enough to learn from, exactly this kind of trap closing around their own predecessors, and who nonetheless walked willingly into a meeting they believed had been called to settle a dispute peacefully. Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, Philip Giacconi, known as Phil Lucky, and Dominic Trinchera, known as Big Trin, arrived together at a social club and cafe in Brooklyn's Bensonhurst neighborhood, believing they were about to attend what had been described to them as an administrative meeting, a gathering meant to resolve the accumulating tension between their own faction and the leadership still loyal to the imprisoned Philip Rastelli. Understanding exactly what these three men represented within the family's internal politics matters enormously for grasping why their removal became, in the eyes of Rastelli's most trusted captains, an urgent and necessary act, rather than simply one more episode in an ongoing rivalry that might otherwise have continued indefinitely without producing quite this level of decisive, coordinated violence. Sonny Red Indelicato led a faction that had grown increasingly resistant to Rastelli's continuing authority over the family, a resistance rooted partly in genuine disagreement over strategy and direction, and partly in the simple, practical reality that a boss who spent most of his adult life locked behind prison walls could never fully command the same immediate, on-the-ground respect that a captain physically present and actively leading his own crew through the family's daily operations could command instead. Sonny Red's own son, Bruno Indelicato, had participated directly in the killing of Carmine Galante 2 years earlier, work carried out on Rastelli's own behalf, which makes the son's family's subsequent turn against that same boss's continued authority a particularly bitter illustration of exactly how quickly loyalty within this specific world could shift once circumstances and personal ambition pointed in a different direction. The men responsible for organizing the actual response to this rebellious faction were Dominic Napolitano, whose own subsequent story this account has already begun tracing through his relationship with the undercover agent he still believed to be an ordinary criminal associate, and Joseph Massino, the same capable captain who had already helped coordinate Galante's own removal 2 years earlier, and who was, by this point in the family's history, emerging as one of the single most important operational figures within the entire organization, regardless of what title he formally held on paper at any given moment. Massino and Napolitano concluded, evidently with the tacit or explicit approval of Rastelli himself, communicating through trusted channels from his own continued imprisonment, that the rebellious faction represented by Sonny Red and his allies needed to be eliminated decisively before their continued resistance could grow into something considerably more dangerous and considerably harder to contain through any later, more measured response. On the day of the killing itself, Massino led Trinchera, Giacconi, and Indelicato directly to a nightclub called the 2020 Club in Brooklyn, maintaining throughout the entire approach the careful pretense that this gathering represented a genuine opportunity to work out some form of lasting peace between the two competing factions. This specific detail deserves particular attention because it illustrates precisely the same pattern this broader account has already traced repeatedly across other criminal organizations and other decades. Ambitious, capable men lured toward their own deaths through the deliberate manipulation of exactly the kind of trust and shared history that should, in theory, have made this specific betrayal considerably harder to execute than it actually proved to be in practice. These were not strangers meeting for the first time under suspicious circumstances. These were men who had worked alongside each other for years, who understood the family's internal politics intimately, and who nonetheless walked into a trap specifically because the invitation had come wrapped in exactly the kind of familiar, plausible framing that made genuine suspicion difficult to sustain in the moment that actually mattered most. As Trinchera, Giacconi, and Indelicato entered the building, 4 masked gunmen emerged suddenly from a closet where they had been waiting and opened fire without warning. Among the men carrying out the actual shooting were Salvatore Vitale, whose own subsequent significance to this broader family history this account will trace in considerably greater depth across the sections still ahead, and Vito Rizzuto, a figure connected to the family's considerable interests extending north into Montreal. Interests this account touched on briefly in earlier sections examining the family's international reach beyond New York itself. According to accounts of the shooting that emerged later, one of the gunmen shouted that this was a holdup as the shooting began. A strange, almost theatrical detail that suggests either a genuine, if ultimately pointless, attempt to disguise the true nature of the ambush even as it unfolded, or simply the kind of chaotic, adrenaline-driven confusion that so often accompanies sudden, coordinated violence, regardless of how carefully the overall plan has actually been arranged in advance. The 3 targeted men, taken entirely by surprise despite whatever lingering wariness men in their position might reasonably have carried into any meeting billed as a negotiation between openly rival factions, attempted to flee once the shooting started, but found themselves unable to escape the ambush that had been prepared specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. All 3 were shot dead inside the club's storeroom, an ending that would become known across the underworld, and eventually across popular culture itself, simply as the 3 captains' murder, or sometimes the 3 capos' murder, a killing whose precise details would remain genuinely obscure to investigators for years, in part because of what happened to 2 of the bodies once the shooting itself had actually finished. One crucial detail deserves particular attention here, because it involves a figure whose own conduct that day raises questions this account cannot fully resolve, but should not simply ignore either. A 4th captain, Anthony Bruno Indelicato, the son of Sonny Red, had reportedly been expected to attend this same meeting, but did not arrive, evading the fate that claimed his own father and the other 2 captains gathered that day. Surveillance photographs taken by federal agents afterward reportedly showed Bruno being congratulated outside a Manhattan social club run by a powerful Gambino family underboss in the hours immediately following the killing, a detail that has fueled considerable speculation among historians and journalists examining this case, about whether Bruno himself had some advanced knowledge of what was actually planned for that day, and whether his own absence from the meeting that killed his father represented a genuine stroke of luck, or something considerably more calculated and considerably more troubling. This account cannot resolve that specific question with any real confidence, and it deserves to be flagged honestly as exactly the kind of unsettled detail that continues to surround this particular killing, even decades after it actually took place. What followed the killing itself illustrates something this broader account has already traced repeatedly across other organizations examined in earlier work: the practical, transactional way these organizations rewarded the men who carried out even the most brutal internal violence on behalf of the leadership that had ordered it. Bruno Indelicato himself, along with Dominic Trinchera's own killer and Cesare Bonventre, the same Sicilian bodyguard whose earlier betrayal of Carmine Galante this account examined in considerable detail in an earlier section, were all rewarded with promotions to crew boss positions specifically in recognition of their participation in the triple murder. This detail matters because it demonstrates, with unusual clarity, exactly how completely this specific violence functioned as ordinary business advancement within the family's internal structure, rather than as some kind of exceptional, unusually severe response reserved only for the gravest imaginable circumstances. Killing 3 of the organization's own captains, men who had spent years working alongside the very soldiers now being promoted for ending their lives, represented, within this specific culture, simply the most direct and most effective available path toward personal advancement, once the family's actual leadership had concluded that removing those particular captains served the organization's own broader interests. The disposal of the bodies afterward became its own separate mystery, one that would eventually consume considerable investigative effort from federal authorities working the case across the following decades. Trinchera and Giacone's remains were not immediately located, buried instead in locations that would remain unknown to investigators for years, a detail connecting directly to the broader pattern this account has already traced in earlier sections, examining how thoroughly criminal organizations across multiple different cultures and multiple different countries developed specific, deliberate methods for making victims disappear entirely, denying grieving families any possibility of a funeral, and denying investigators any physical evidence that might eventually support a formal prosecution. It would take years of patient forensic and investigative work, eventually assisted by the cooperation of former Bonanno members who chose to break their own silence about exactly what had happened that day, before authorities finally recovered the remains and pieced together a complete, prosecutable account of the killing. The immediate practical effect of the 3 captains' murder within the Bonanno organization itself proved decisive in exactly the way Massino and Napolitano had presumably intended when they first began planning it. With the rebellious faction's most significant leadership eliminated in a single coordinated strike, resistance to Rastelli's continuing authority effectively collapsed, at least for the time being, and Massino himself emerged from the killing as unambiguously the most powerful operational figure within the entire family, a position that reflected both his own direct role in planning and executing the ambush, and his continuing close relationship with Rastelli, whose formal authority as boss the entire operation had been carried out specifically to protect and reinforce. What makes this specific episode particularly worth examining, alongside everything else traced across this broader account, is how directly it connects to the events this account will examine in the section immediately following. Because the same basic method that had just proven so effective against 3 experienced, wary captains would very shortly need to be applied again, this time against one of the very men who had helped plan and carry out this exact killing in the first place. Dominic Napolitano, having proven his own value and his own capability by helping eliminate the rebellious faction that had threatened Rastelli's authority, would within a matter of months find himself facing exactly the same fate he had just helped arrange for Sonny Red, Phil Lucky, and Big Trin, not because he had rebelled against the family's leadership the way the 3 murdered captains had, but because of a discovery about his own personal life that would prove, in the eyes of the very men he had loyally served, every bit as unforgivable as open rebellion itself. There is a particular grim symmetry worth sitting with in how quickly this pattern repeated itself within the same organization, across the very same year. The 3 captains murdered in May 1981 died because they had positioned themselves in open opposition to Rastelli's continuing leadership, a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, act of internal rebellion against an authority they had concluded no longer deserved their continued loyalty. Napolitano, whose own death this account will trace directly in the section that follows, died for something considerably different, not for opposing the family's leadership, but for a catastrophic failure of judgment in exactly the kind of personal trust and loyalty this entire account has traced as the family's supposed defining strength since its earliest origins in Castellammare del Golfo. Two different failures, rebellion in one case and misplaced trust in the other, produced, within the space of a single calendar year, the exact same outcome for the men involved: a closet full of waiting gunmen, or a meeting from which there would be no genuine possibility of walking away. This account has already traced, across its earlier examination of other organized crime cultures in other work, how thoroughly ambitious men within these criminal cultures could turn violently against each other whenever circumstances demanded it. But the specific compression of these two nearly identical betrayals into a single year within a single family illustrates something particularly stark about exactly how unstable and how genuinely dangerous the Bonanno organization had actually become by the early 1980s. Barely more than a decade removed from Joseph Bonanno's own disastrous, decade-spanning war against the very commission structure his own younger self had helped establish half a century earlier. The family that had once prided itself on blood loyalty and hometown solidarity, tracing directly back to a single small Sicilian fishing village, had, by this point in its history, become an organization where captains needed to fear peace meetings called by their own colleagues, and where the very men most trusted to carry out the family's internal enforcement found themselves, within months, facing exactly the same brutal calculation they had just applied to others. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 captains died believing they were walking into a negotiation, killed by men who would soon discover exactly how thin the line separating loyal service from sudden betrayal actually ran within their own family. The next section follows Napolitano directly to his own final meeting, once word finally reached him about exactly who his closest friend had actually been all along. Section 7. The man who gave away his pigeons. Dominic Napolitano understood, in a way that separates his own story from almost every other betrayal examined across this account, exactly what was coming for him before it actually arrived. There was no ambush he walked into unaware, no meeting disguised as something innocent enough to disarm his own considerable street instincts. Napolitano knew, in the specific days before his own death, that he had made a mistake severe enough to cost him his life, and he spent those final days quietly putting his own affairs in order with a resigned, almost gentle clarity that makes his particular ending one of the more genuinely haunting chapters in this entire family's history. Napolitano had been born in the Greenpoint section of Brooklyn in 1930, the grandson of immigrants who had come from Naples rather than from the specific Castellamarese network that had originally founded the family bearing Bonanno's name, a detail that mattered somewhat less by this later period in the organization's history than it might have mattered decades earlier, once the family had long since expanded well beyond its original, tightly bound hometown origins. His nickname, Sonny Black, came from the simple fact that he dyed his naturally silver hair black, a small vanity that nonetheless captures something of the man's own particular character, someone who cared about appearances and about maintaining a certain image even as he rose through one of the most violent criminal organizations in the entire country. He had risen to prominence in 1973 as a soldier working under a capo named Michael Sabella, eventually being promoted to capo himself once his own mentor stepped back, following Carmine Galante's 1979 execution, a promotion that placed Napolitano directly at the center of exactly the kind of internal power struggle this account has already traced across the family's preceding decade. By 1976, an ambitious jewel thief had begun working his way into the orbit of various Bonanno family soldiers, first through a lower-ranking associate named Anthony Mira, and eventually finding his way into Napolitano's own crew, where he quickly proved himself capable, reliable, and genuinely likable in exactly the ways that mattered most within this specific criminal culture. This man called himself Donnie Brasco, and Napolitano, over the following years, grew to trust him with a warmth and an openness that went considerably beyond ordinary criminal association. Accounts from this period describe Brasco sometimes sleeping on Napolitano's own couch, the two men watching cartoons together in the mornings like old friends rather than like a capo and one of his own soldiers. a detail that illustrates precisely how completely Napolitano had allowed this particular relationship to cross from calculated criminal partnership into something considerably closer to genuine personal affection. Brasco, of course, was not actually a jewel thief at all. He was Joseph Pistone, a Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent who had spent years working undercover, specifically to penetrate the Bonanno family's inner workings, an assignment that would eventually stretch across roughly 6 years, from September 1976 until July 1981, making it one of the longest and most successful undercover infiltrations in the entire history of American law enforcement's efforts against organized crime. Pistone's success depended almost entirely on his ability to cultivate exactly the kind of deep, personal trust that Napolitano had extended to him so completely. And the specific tragedy embedded in this particular betrayal is that Pistone's success as an undercover operative and Napolitano's own genuine, warm friendship toward the man he believed to be Donnie Brasco were not, in any meaningful sense, separate or contradictory facts. Pistone had built a relationship real enough that Napolitano trusted him not merely as a useful criminal associate, but as someone worth watching cartoons with, someone worth genuinely liking as a person. This depth of trust led Napolitano, in September 1981, to make a decision that would prove catastrophic for exactly the reasons this account has already traced repeatedly across other organizations examined in earlier sections. Napolitano proposed Brasco for full membership within the Bonanno family itself, the formal induction ceremony that would make him a fully made man, an honor that reflected the genuine confidence Napolitano had developed in a person he still believed to be a loyal, capable criminal associate rather than a federal agent who had spent years documenting the family's inner workings in exhaustive detail. Alongside this proposed induction, Napolitano assigned Brasco a specific, deadly task, ordering him to kill Bruno Indelicato, the son of the murdered Sonny Red who had, as this account examined in the preceding section, evaded the ambush that killed his own father and 2 other captains months earlier. This assignment placed federal authorities in an impossible position. Allowing their own undercover agent to actually carry out a real murder was obviously never a genuine possibility, but pulling Pistone out of his assignment at this specific moment, immediately after he had been formally proposed for full membership and handed a direct killing assignment, would inevitably raise exactly the kind of suspicion that could expose the entire operation and potentially endanger Pistone's own life, along with the lives of the informants and associates who had helped make his years of undercover work possible. The Bureau made the decision to end Pistone's assignment at this point, extracting him from the operation before the proposed induction ceremony and the assigned killing could actually take place. A decision that meant Napolitano would very shortly discover exactly who his trusted friend and protege had actually been all along. Word reached Napolitano, through channels this account cannot fully reconstruct with complete certainty, that Donnie Brasco was in fact an undercover FBI agent, and that years of the family's own internal conversations, operational details, and criminal planning had been quietly documented and reported directly to federal investigators. Throughout the entire period, Napolitano had considered Brasco one of his own most trusted and most personally liked associates. The scale of this exposure cannot be overstated within the specific logic of this particular criminal culture. This account has already traced, across its earlier examination of other organized crime cultures, how absolutely central the concept of omerta, the code of silence, and the total, permanent rejection of any cooperation with law enforcement remain to this entire criminal tradition's own understanding of itself. Napolitano had not simply made an ordinary business mistake. He had personally vouched for, personally mentored, and personally proposed for sacred membership a man who represented the single most complete violation of the family's own foundational principles that this account has examined anywhere across its entire history. What makes Napolitano's specific response to this discovery so genuinely distinctive, set against everything else this broader account has traced across multiple different criminal cultures and multiple different decades, is the almost eerie calm with which he appears to have accepted what was now inevitably coming for him. Rather than attempting to flee, rather than seeking to explain himself or negotiate some form of leniency from the family's leadership, Napolitano seems to have concluded, with a resignation that several accounts of his final days describe in genuinely striking detail, that he had made his own bed, in the specific phrase one account examining his story later used, and now needed to lie in it. An acceptance of consequence that stands in sharp, almost startling contrast against the more common pattern this account has traced of men fighting desperately, plotting countermoves, or fleeing entirely once they understood that a fatal reckoning had become unavoidable. On August 17, 1981, Napolitano was called to a meeting with other members of the Bonanno family. Before leaving his own apartment for what he clearly understood might be the final time, he gave away his personal jewelry to a bartender he particularly favored, and handed over the keys to his own apartment, specifically so that someone could continue looking after his pet pigeons, a detail so small and so genuinely tender that it sits with real discomfort alongside everything else examined across this violent, calculating history. This was a man who kept pigeons, who worried, in his own final hours, about who would feed and care for them once he was gone, arranging these small, domestic details with the same careful attention he had once brought to his own work as a capo within one of the most feared criminal organizations in the entire country. According to an account Pistone himself later shared in an interview years afterward, Napolitano's girlfriend, a woman named Judy, contacted the former undercover agent sometime after these events and told him that Napolitano, in his own final days, had expressed no genuine ill will toward the man he had known as Donnie Brasco. Napolitano had apparently told her that if anyone was destined to bring about his own downfall, he found himself glad, in some genuinely strange and complicated way, that it had been Pistone specifically. A sentiment that suggests something about the particular quality of the relationship these two men had actually built during Pistone's years of undercover work, a friendship real enough on Napolitano's side that even the catastrophic discovery of its underlying deception could not entirely erase whatever genuine affection had developed alongside it. Napolitano was killed upon arriving at the meeting he had been summoned to attend, pushed down a set of stairs and shot, dying immediately once the confrontation actually began. According to later accounts pieced together through cooperating witnesses, the actual killing was carried out at the house of a Bonanno associate nicknamed Ronnie the Monkey Man, with the shooting itself credited to this associate, along with another button man working alongside him. Joseph Massino, whose own role in orchestrating this specific killing this account will examine in considerably greater depth in the section still ahead, reportedly explained his reasoning for ordering Napolitano's death in a phrase that has since become one of the more quoted lines connected to this entire chapter of the family's history, stating that he had to give Napolitano what amounted to a receipt for the entire Donnie Brasco situation, language that reduces an execution rooted in one of the most catastrophic security failures in the family's entire history, to the kind of cold, transactional bookkeeping term that this broader account has already traced repeatedly across other organizations examined in earlier sections. The wider fallout from Pistone's undercover operation extended considerably beyond Napolitano's own death alone. Benjamin Ruggiero, known as Lefty, the soldier who had originally brought Brasco into Napolitano's own crew years earlier and who had personally vouched for him within the organization, understood immediately that he too now faced almost certain death for his own role in bringing an undercover federal agent this deep into the family's confidence. Federal authorities reportedly approached Ruggiero directly, offering him the opportunity to join the government's own side and cooperate against his former associates in exchange for protection from the retribution he clearly understood was coming. Ruggiero refused this offer, choosing instead to accept whatever consequence the family itself might eventually impose, rather than break the same code of silence his own unwitting sponsorship of Pistone had already so catastrophically compromised. He was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison on charges connected to the broader operation, a sentence he served without ever becoming the kind of cooperating informant that circumstances might reasonably have pushed him toward. Even after Pistone's true identity had been publicly confirmed, several mobsters connected to the case reportedly refused to believe it, a detail that illustrates something genuinely important about how thoroughly this specific betrayal cut against the family's own fundamental understanding of how trust and loyalty were actually supposed to function within their world. The idea that a federal agent could embed himself this deeply, for this many years, close enough to sleep on a capo's own couch and watch cartoons with him in the morning, struck some within the organization as almost impossible to accept, even once the government's own case had made the reality undeniable. What Napolitano's death ultimately demonstrates, set alongside everything else this account has traced across the family's history, from Castellammare del Golfo, through the Castellamarese War, and now through this specific, deeply personal betrayal, is that the particular danger facing this organization had evolved considerably beyond the internal, self-inflicted violence this account has examined in every preceding section. Maranzano died at the hands of his own students. Bonanno's own family tore itself apart fighting a war he had started against the commission he himself helped build. Galante died betrayed by the very Sicilian bodyguards he trusted, specifically because of their shared blood origin. Each of these earlier betrayals came from within the criminal world itself, ambitious men calculating that removing a rival or a boss served their own interests better than continued loyalty. Napolitano's death came from something categorically different, an external threat that had patiently, skillfully constructed exactly the kind of internal trust this organization had always relied upon to protect itself, and had used that trust not to seize power within the criminal underworld, but to document and dismantle the entire criminal world from the outside in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Napolitano gave away his pigeons and walked calmly toward his own death, undone by a friendship that turned out to be real on one side and an assignment on the other. The next section follows what happened once the commission itself decided the entire family needed to pay a price for having been infiltrated this deeply, and the quiet, patient captain who used the resulting chaos to make himself the last man standing. Section 8. The Last Dawn. The Commission's response to discovering exactly how deeply Joseph Pistone had infiltrated the Bonanno family carried consequences that extended considerably beyond the individual men who had personally trusted him. This account has already traced, across its earlier examination of other criminal organizations in different work, how thoroughly these governing bodies within organized crime tended to view any security breach as a threat to the entire underworld's collective interests, rather than simply a private matter affecting one specific family. The other 4 New York families, upon learning the full scale of what had actually happened, the years an undercover agent had spent embedded so deeply he had nearly become a formally made member, concluded that the Bonanno organization itself had become dangerously, unacceptably compromised, a liability that threatened to expose the wider commission's own operations if the family's internal security remained this fundamentally broken. The commission's formal response was to strip the Bonanno family of its seat on the governing council entirely, banishing the organization from participation in the upper-level councils that had, since Charles Luciano first established the commission's structure in the aftermath of Salvatore Maranzano's own death decades earlier, governed the cooperative relationship between New York's major crime families. This punishment represented a genuine and significant demotion within the specific hierarchy this account has traced since its earliest sections, examining the family's founding, an organization that had once stood as one of 5 formally equal families, now found itself formally excluded from the very body that had defined organized crime's governing structure across New York for half a century. What makes this specific punishment particularly worth examining, set against everything else this account has traced across the family's history, is the genuinely strange, almost accidental benefit that emerged from what should have been an unambiguous disaster. Because the Bonanno family had been banished from the commission entirely, its leadership found itself excluded from participation in a landmark 1986 prosecution that history would remember as the Mafia Commission Trial, a case that successfully convicted the heads of several other major New York families, using exactly the kind of theoretical framework this account has examined in earlier work, covering the Sicilian Mafia's own eventual prosecution, decades later, treating the commission itself as a single, coordinated criminal enterprise whose leadership could be held responsible for crimes committed throughout the entire organization. The Bonanno family's exclusion from the commission, intended purely as a punishment and a humiliation, ironically spared its own leadership from facing exactly the kind of devastating prosecution that crippled several of its rival families during this same period, leaving the Bonanno organization's core leadership structure intact at precisely the moment when its competitors were being systematically dismantled through the courts. This unexpected reprieve mattered enormously for the man who would eventually inherit control over what remained of the family following Philip Rastelli's own death from liver cancer in 1991, after nearly 2 decades during which Rastelli had spent the overwhelming majority of his formal tenure as boss, locked behind prison walls, governing an organization he could rarely see or touch directly with his own hands. Joseph Massino, the same capable captain this account has already traced coordinating the killing of Carmine Galante, and later orchestrating the 3 captains' murder that eliminated the rebellious faction opposing Rastelli's continued authority, took complete and formal control of the family following Rastelli's death, having spent the preceding decade quietly building exactly the kind of operational competence and personal loyalty among the family's remaining soldiers that would make his own eventual ascension to boss feel less like a contested struggle and more like the simple, inevitable recognition of authority he had already been exercising in practice for years. Massino brought to his own leadership a set of lessons absorbed directly and carefully from watching every single disaster this account has traced across the preceding decades of the family's history. He had watched Joseph Bonanno's own reckless ambition against the Commission destroy years of stability and nearly tear the entire organization apart. He had watched Carmine Galante's visible, flamboyant aggression and his trust in imported Sicilian loyalty get him killed by the very bodyguards he had personally brought over from the old country. He had watched Dominic Napolitano's genuine warmth and openness toward an outsider nearly bring down the entire family through years of undercover federal infiltration. Massino, having absorbed every one of these specific failures with unusual care, built his own leadership style around a single, overriding principle that stood in deliberate, calculated contrast to every predecessor examined across this entire account: absolute, obsessive security consciousness, combined with a deliberately low, unglamorous public profile that avoided almost every trap that had claimed the men who had led this organization before him. Massino closed down the family's traditional social clubs entirely, recognizing that these fixed, well-known meeting locations had made previous generations of Bonanno leadership dramatically easier for federal surveillance teams to monitor and eventually penetrate. He ordered that face-to-face meetings between family members occur exclusively in remote locations, or, in a particularly distinctive touch, while actually driving and moving vehicles, a practice specifically designed to defeat the kind of fixed electronic surveillance that had proven so devastating to organized crime prosecutions across the preceding decades this account has already examined. He forbade his own soldiers from even speaking his actual name aloud during conversations that might potentially be monitored, instructing associates to instead tug on their own ear as a silent, physical signal whenever they needed to reference their boss, a gesture distinctive enough that it eventually earned Massino his own particular underworld nickname, the Ear. This obsessive, almost paranoid approach to operational security proved, for a genuinely remarkable stretch of years, extraordinarily effective. Throughout the 1990s, as federal prosecutors continued systematically dismantling the leadership of New York's other major crime families, using exactly the kind of RICO prosecutions and cooperating witness testimony this account has traced, destroying organized crime leadership across multiple other cities and multiple other decades, Massino remained free, active, and firmly in control of his own organization, while the bosses of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families cycled through one prosecution after another, often governing from behind prison walls in exactly the pattern Rastelli himself had once been forced to accept. Massino earned, during this specific period, a nickname that captured his own genuinely unusual status within the broader landscape of New York organized crime, becoming known throughout the underworld and eventually within federal law enforcement circles as the Last Don, the only sitting boss among all 5 families who remained entirely outside prison walls, while every one of his counterparts sat behind them. Massino steered the family's operations during this period toward labor union racketeering and away from the kind of high-profile, visible criminal activity, hijackings, and open street violence that tended to draw exactly the sustained federal attention his own predecessors had so consistently attracted. He rebuilt the Bonanno organization's genuine strength and profitability with a patient, methodical approach that stood in deliberate contrast against the flashier, more visible styles of leadership that had defined the family's earlier history, and he successfully engineered the family's eventual restoration to a seat on the commission itself, reclaiming the formal standing the organization had lost following the Donnie Brasco disaster more than a decade earlier. This restoration mattered considerably, beyond simple institutional pride. It meant Messino had accomplished something no previous Bonanno boss examined across this entire account had managed to sustain for any meaningful length of time. Genuine, stable, long-term leadership that avoided the kind of internal rebellion, external betrayal, or catastrophic security failure that had claimed every single one of his predecessors in one form or another. Where Maranzano lasted less than a year as supreme boss before his own students killed him, where Bonanno spent the better part of a decade fighting an internal war his own ambition had provoked, where Galante lasted only a few years before his imported bodyguards betrayed him, and where Rastelli spent the overwhelming majority of his formal tenure locked away in prison, Messino built something that looked, for the better part of a decade, like genuine, durable institutional stability. This stability rested, however, on a foundation that this account's earlier examination of similar patterns across other criminal organizations should make immediately recognizable as inherently unstable, regardless of how carefully any individual leader managed to disguise that instability for a time. Messino's own security depended entirely on the continued personal loyalty of the men closest to him, the very same soldiers and captains who had, across every single preceding chapter of this family's history, eventually proven willing to turn against whichever boss happened to be leading them, once circumstances shifted sufficiently in favor of a different arrangement. Among the men closest to Messino during this period of apparent stability was his own brother-in-law, a capable operative named Salvatore Vitale, the same soldier this account identified in an earlier section as one of the actual gunmen who had helped carry out the three captains' murder in 1981, and whose continued closeness to Messino across the following 2 decades made him privy to exactly the kind of intimate operational knowledge that, in every previous chapter of this family's history examined across this entire account, had eventually proven catastrophic for whichever boss happened to trust the wrong person with it. The particular tragedy embedded in Messino's eventual downfall, which this account will trace in full across the section immediately following, lies precisely in how successfully he had managed to avoid every other trap that claimed his predecessors, only to discover that the specific vulnerability this account has already identified as the single most consistent pattern across this entire family's history, personal betrayal from within the innermost circle of trust, could not actually be engineered away through better operational security alone. Messino had closed the social clubs. He had banned the use of his own name. He had moved meetings into cars and remote locations, specifically to defeat electronic surveillance. What he could not do, what none of his predecessors examined across this entire account had ever managed to do either, was guarantee that the men closest to him, the brother-in-law who had helped him kill 3 captains decades earlier, the captains who had built their own careers and their own fortunes directly under his patient, careful leadership, would remain loyal indefinitely once their own personal calculations eventually shifted against him. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, one that connects directly back to the very earliest sections of this entire account examining the family's founding origins in Castellammare del Golfo. The organization had begun as an extension of genuine blood ties and hometown loyalty, men connected by literal kinship and shared origin who understood, at least initially, that they could trust each other in a way they would never trust an outsider. By the time Messino built his own careful, patient reign atop this same organization more than 60 years later, that original blood-based foundation had long since given way to something considerably more transactional. Soldiers and captains bound to their boss, not by shared hometown origin or generational family connection, but by the simple, ongoing calculation that continued loyalty served their own interests better than the available alternatives. This transactional foundation had proven durable enough to sustain Messino's own leadership for well over a decade, longer than almost any other single reign examined across this entire account. It would prove, in the end, no more durable than any of the blood-based loyalties that had failed every single one of his predecessors, once federal pressure finally grew intense enough to make betrayal once again the more attractive option for the men closest to the family's own last and most careful, Don. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Massino learned every lesson his predecessor's disasters had to teach him, and built the most stable reign in the family's entire history on exactly that education. The next section follows what happened once his own brother-in-law decided that even the last Don's careful decades of leadership were not worth protecting any longer. Section 9. The first rat wore a boss's jacket. Joseph Massino's careful, decade-spanning reign as the only sitting boss among New York's 5 families who managed to avoid prison finally began unraveling in a manner that connects directly back to a specific, unresolved detail. This account examines several sections earlier. The disposal of the bodies following the 1981 Three Captains murder had remained one of the family's most closely guarded secrets for more than 2 decades. The specific locations where Dominic Trinchera and Philip Giacone's remains had actually been buried, known only to a small handful of men who had personally participated in disposing of them. That secret finally began coming apart in a manner almost comically mundane given the scale of everything it would eventually expose, when a severed foot surfaced in a vacant lot in Queens, a discovery that launched exactly the kind of painstaking, patient forensic investigation this account has already traced, destroying other organized crime operations across multiple different cities and multiple different decades. The investigation that followed this initial discovery combined old-fashioned detective work with something considerably more novel within the specific history of organized crime prosecution, forensic accounting techniques that allowed federal investigators to trace Massino's own considerable personal wealth back to its actual criminal origins with a level of documentary precision that made denial increasingly difficult to sustain. This combination of physical evidence, patient accounting work, and, crucially, the eventual cooperation of 2 Bonanno family captains who became government witnesses in 2002, entering the Federal Witness Protection Program rather than continuing to risk their own freedom protecting a boss whose own operational security, however careful, could not indefinitely shield them from the accumulating weight of a multi-decade federal investigation, finally gave prosecutors the foundation they needed to move directly against Massino himself. On January 9, 2003, Joseph Massino was arrested as part of a sweeping racketeering indictment that included charges connected directly to the 1981 killing of Dominic Napolitano, the very murder this account traced in detail several sections earlier, alongside numerous other charges spanning decades of the family's criminal operations under his own leadership. Arrested alongside Massino was his own brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, the same soldier this account has already identified as one of the actual gunmen who helped carry out the Three Captains' murder more than 2 decades earlier, and whose personal closeness to Massino across the following years had made him privy to exactly the kind of intimate operational knowledge that this account's earlier examination of similar patterns should make immediately recognizable as inherently dangerous to whichever boss happened to trust him with it. Vitale's own decision, once faced with his own arrest and the very real possibility of spending the remainder of his life in federal prison, followed a pattern this account has already traced repeatedly across other organized crime figures examined in earlier sections, choosing his own personal freedom over continued loyalty to a boss he had served faithfully for decades. Once the accumulated pressure of federal prosecution made that continued loyalty considerably more costly than the available alternative, Vitale became a government witness, testifying directly against Massino at the boss's own subsequent trial, providing exactly the kind of detailed, first-hand testimony about the family's internal operations that no amount of Massino's own careful operational security, no closed social clubs, no meetings conducted in moving vehicles, no elaborate system of ear-tugging to avoid speaking his own name aloud, could actually protect him from once the man closest to him within his own family had decided that cooperation served his own interests better than continued silence. This particular betrayal deserves careful attention set against everything this account has already traced across the family's entire history, because it represents, in a genuinely distilled form, the exact same underlying pattern that had already claimed every single one of Massino's predecessors across more than 70 years of the organization's existence. Massino had watched Bonanno's own war against the Commission consume years of stability through reckless personal ambition. He had watched Galante's trust in imported Sicilian bodyguards prove fatally misplaced once those same bodyguards concluded their own advancement mattered more than the loyalty owed to the man who had brought them to America. He had watched Napolitano's genuine friendship with an undercover federal agent nearly destroy the entire organization from within. Massino had absorbed every one of these lessons carefully enough to avoid repeating any of them directly, and he still found himself undone by the exact same underlying vulnerability that had claimed every predecessor before him, a trusted insider, his own brother-in-law, deciding that continued loyalty no longer served his own interests once the calculation shifted decisively against it. Massino's trial began on May 24, 2004, and the government's case against him proved comprehensive enough that he was convicted on July 30, 2004, on all counts, including charges connected to 7 separate murders spanning his entire career within the organization, encompassing the 3 captains killed in 1981, alongside Napolitano and Anthony Mira, the same soldier this account identified in an earlier section as the man who had originally introduced Joseph Pistone into the Bonanno family's orbit, before Napolitano's own deeper friendship with the undercover agent eventually proved considerably more consequential. Massino faced a sentence of life imprisonment, without any possibility of parole, a devastating outcome on its own terms, but one that carried an additional, considerably more terrifying complication. Federal prosecutors were preparing to pursue an 8th murder charge against him in a separate subsequent trial, one that could potentially expose him to the federal death penalty, a possibility that would prove decisive in shaping the extraordinary decision Massino made only months after his own conviction. On January 27, 2005, news broke that would send genuine shock through organized crime circles across the entire country, circles that had, by this point in the broader history this account has traced, witnessed betrayal of almost every conceivable kind across multiple different decades and multiple different criminal organizations. Joseph Massino, the last Don, the only sitting 5-family boss who had spent an entire decade avoiding the prison sentences that claimed every one of his rivals, had begun cooperating directly with the very federal authorities who had just convicted him. In a detail that captures something almost unbearably direct about the specific nature of this particular betrayal, Massino had secretly recorded his own hand-picked successor, a captain named Vincent Basciano, known throughout the underworld as Vinnie Gorgeous, discussing plans to assassinate the very federal prosecutor who had built the case against Massino himself, conversations the FBI had specifically arranged for Massino to help capture once his own cooperation agreement had been established. This detail matters enormously for understanding exactly how thoroughly Massino's own transformation had proceeded once he made his decision. He was not simply providing historical testimony about crimes committed years or decades earlier. The pattern this account has traced, through other cooperating witnesses, examined across its broader history of organized crime. Massino was actively, in real time, working directly with federal investigators to build a case against the man he had personally chosen to lead the very organization Massino himself had spent decades building and protecting. Massino later explained his own decision in terms that strip away almost every layer of dramatic complexity this account might otherwise be tempted to add, stating simply that he had been convicted and had therefore decided to cooperate, a bluntness that matches the essentially transactional, calculated nature of the decision itself. Massino's cooperation eventually extended into open courtroom testimony, and on the specific day he first took the witness stand to testify directly against Basciano, he became, according to the historical record this account has already established, the first boss in the entire history of the American Mafia to personally testify against his own successor from the witness stand. Pointing directly at Basciano during his testimony, Massino identified him by description, referring to that guy in the gray suit sitting there, while Basciano reportedly stared back at his own former mentor and chewed candy throughout the exchange, a small, almost absurd detail that nonetheless captures something of the genuinely strange, deflated quality that had come to characterize this particular chapter of the family's history by this point. Massino testified that Basciano had confessed to him, during a period when both men were incarcerated together, that he had ordered the killing of an associate named Randy Pizzolo, and further testified that Basciano had once volunteered to personally help exterminate any informants operating within the family, using a pre-arranged code word to signal potential targets, unaware at the time that the very man he was making this offer to had already become exactly the kind of informant he was volunteering to help eliminate. Massino's own testimony revealed, in one particularly striking exchange, that Basciano had at one point specifically suspected Salvatore Vitali himself of having become an informant, and had proposed killing him as he walked out of a gym, a suspicion that would prove entirely correct, though not quickly enough to prevent Vitali's own cooperation from eventually helping bring down Massino himself. This detail illustrates something genuinely remarkable about the specific texture of betrayal that had come to define this organization by this final chapter of its history. An environment where suspicion of informants had become so pervasive that even accurate suspicions arrived too late to prevent the betrayals they correctly anticipated. An organization eating itself alive from multiple directions simultaneously with a speed that no individual boss's own careful security precautions could realistically outrun. Massino's ultimate cooperation proved extraordinarily costly to him personally, in terms of the wealth he had spent decades accumulating. In securing his own government cooperation agreement, Massino forfeited $12 million, along with hundreds of gold bars discovered hidden inside one of his own restaurants, and an additional $7 million in cash found concealed in his own attic. A detail that illustrates the genuine scale of the personal fortune Massino had built across his decades atop the organization, and the price he was ultimately willing to pay to escape the death penalty and secure the possibility of eventual release from a sentence that had originally condemned him to life behind bars, without any hope of parole. In June 2013, Brooklyn federal judge Nicholas Garofis resentenced Massino to time served, granting him supervised release for the remainder of his life, in recognition of the decade of cooperation, secretly recorded conversations, and direct courtroom testimony he had provided against his own former associates. What remains? Examining Massino's own extraordinary trajectory, alongside everything this account has traced across the family's entire history, from its earliest origins in Castellammare del Golfo, is a genuinely remarkable final irony. This account opened its examination of this specific family by tracing a culture built explicitly around blood loyalty, hometown solidarity, and a specific, inherited code of silence that traced back directly to a small Sicilian fishing village, and the particular clan-based traditions that town had carried across an entire ocean. Across more than 7 decades, and 9 sections of this account, that supposed culture of unbreakable loyalty had proven, in case after case, considerably less durable than the accumulated weight of ambition, calculation, and personal survival instinct that had actually driven almost every consequential decision this account has traced. Massino himself had absorbed every one of those earlier lessons more completely and more carefully than any single predecessor examined across this entire history, building the single most stable and most successful reign the organization had ever produced, specifically by avoiding every individual mistake that had claimed the men who came before him. And when his own turn finally came to choose between the code he had spent decades enforcing and his own personal survival, he made precisely the same choice that every other pivotal figure across this entire account had already made before him, choosing himself, and in doing so, becoming the very thing his entire organization's founding culture had once insisted was categorically impossible, the first boss of a 5 family in the history of the American Mafia to personally break omertà from the witness stand. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Massino avoided every trap that killed his predecessors, and still ended up doing the one thing this entire family's founding code had always insisted no boss would ever do. The final section of this account draws together everything this history has traced, from a Sicilian fishing village to a federal witness stand, and asks what all of it actually reveals about the family the movies never got right. Section 10. A Man of Honor. In 1983, decades after his own reckless ambition had nearly destroyed the organization bearing his name, and years after his own forced retirement to Arizona had removed him permanently from any position of genuine authority within the underworld he had once helped govern, Joseph Bonanno published his own memoir. He gave it a title that, examined against everything this account has now traced across the family's full history, reads less like a genuine reflection and more like a kind of quiet, self-serving mythology. He called it A Man of Honor. Consider what that specific phrase actually meant across the 97 years of Bonanno's own remarkably long life, and across the more than 7 decades of organizational history this account has traced, following his family's founding in the smoking aftermath of the Castellamarese War. Honor, within the specific world this account has examined, never actually functioned as a fixed, reliable standard governing how these men treated each other. It functioned instead as a flexible, convenient label applied after the fact to whichever specific act of calculated self-interest had just proven successful. Charles Luciano's betrayal of Giuseppe Masseria, the very killing that decided the Castellamarese War and gave Bonanno his own family in the first place, was honor. Luciano and his allies killing Salvatore Maranzano only months after that same war concluded, eliminating the very man who had led them to victory, was also honor, at least according to the men who carried it out, and the commission structure that emerged directly from their justification for having done it. This pattern, honor redefined continuously to justify whatever calculated betrayal circumstances happen to demand, repeats itself across every single chapter this account has traced. Joseph Bonanno's own plot to assassinate his fellow commission bosses, a scheme every bit as ambitious and every bit as reckless as anything that had gotten Maranzano killed 3 decades earlier, represented, in Bonanno's own mind and in his own later memoir, a legitimate pursuit of his family's rightful interests. The Commission's decision to punish that plot by forcing Magliocco into retirement and driving Bonanno himself into years of hiding represented, from the Commission's own perspective, the necessary enforcement of exactly the kind of collective order this account traced back to Luciano's original founding vision. Both sides of that specific conflict understood themselves as acting honorably. Both sides were, in the most literal and practical sense available, simply calculating their own survival and advancement within a system that had never actually possessed any fixed external standard capable of definitively settling which interpretation was correct. Carmine Galante trusted his own imported Sicilian bodyguards specifically because he believed shared blood and shared hometown origin created an unbreakable form of honor, considerably deeper than anything an ordinary American soldier could offer him. Those same bodyguards, Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato, betrayed him the moment a rival faction offered them genuine advancement within an organization Galante's own continued survival could no longer provide. Within the specific internal logic of this world, their betrayal was not remembered as dishonorable. Bonventre himself was rewarded with rapid promotion specifically because of his role in removing Galante, precisely the same reward structure this account traced again 2 years later, when Bruno Indelicato and Cesare Bonventre both received advancement for their participation in the 3 captains' murder that eliminated Sonny Red's rebellious faction. Betrayal, wearing the correct justification, was never actually punished within this specific culture. It was promoted. Dominic Napolitano's own story complicates this pattern in a way worth sitting with one final time, because his particular ending stands apart from almost everything else this account has traced. Napolitano was not betrayed by a calculating rival seeking his own advancement. He was betrayed by a genuine, sustained deception, constructed by an outsider who had never belonged to this world at all, and who had built, across nearly 6 years of patient undercover work, a friendship real enough that Napolitano reportedly felt no genuine anger toward the man who had ultimately caused his own death. There is something worth acknowledging honestly in this specific detail, an actual, uncalculated warmth existing briefly within a criminal culture this account has otherwise traced as almost entirely governed by transactional self-interest disguised as loyalty. Napolitano's own capacity for genuine friendship, extended toward a man who turned out to be documenting his every move on behalf of the federal government, represents perhaps the single most human moment examined across this entire account, and also, in its own quiet way, the single clearest demonstration of exactly how completely this specific organization's supposed code of blood loyalty and hometown solidarity had become vulnerable to a threat its own founding culture, built around trusting only fellow Sicilians from a single small fishing village, had never actually anticipated needing to guard against. Joseph Massino's own extraordinary trajectory, examined now alongside everything that preceded it across this entire account, offers perhaps the most complete and most devastating illustration of exactly how hollow the concept of honor had actually become by the time the organization reached its final chapters. Massino absorbed every lesson his predecessor's individual disasters had to teach him with a genuine, patient thoroughness that none of them had managed to match. He built the single most stable, most successful reign the family had ever produced, avoiding the reckless ambition that destroyed Bonanno. avoiding the misplaced trust in imported loyalty that destroyed Galante, avoiding the catastrophic security failures that nearly destroyed Napolitano and the entire organization alongside him. And when his own moment of ultimate choice finally arrived, facing conviction on 7 murders and the genuine possibility of a federal death sentence for an 8th, Massino made precisely the same calculation every single figure examined across this entire account had already made before him, choosing his own personal survival over the code he had spent decades enforcing on everyone beneath him, becoming, in the process, the first 5-family boss in the entire history of the American Mafia to personally testify against his own successor from a federal witness stand. What makes Massino's specific betrayal considerably more significant than any single individual act of self-interest examined elsewhere across this account is what it reveals about the entire concept of omertà. This history has traced since its very earliest sections. This account opened by tracing the Bonanno family's origins back to a specific culture, blood loyalty and hometown solidarity, carried directly from Castellammare del Golfo, a culture built around the conviction that family, rather than any outside authority, represented the only structure a person could genuinely trust with his own survival. Omertà, the absolute code of silence this entire criminal tradition claimed to live and die by, represented the practical enforcement mechanism protecting that specific cultural inheritance, the promise that no member, regardless of what pressure the state eventually applied against him, would ever break faith with the family that had raised him up. Massino himself had enforced that exact code with brutal consistency throughout his own decades of leadership, ordering the deaths of men, including his own trusted associates, specifically because their continued existence threatened to expose the family's own internal operations to outside authority. And then, once his own personal calculations shifted decisively enough, Massino broke that same code more completely, and more consequentially, than any single informant examined anywhere else across this entire history of the family, not merely providing historical testimony about crimes long since committed, but actively, in real time, working alongside the very federal government his entire organization existed to evade, helping build a case against his own hand-picked successor, using secretly recorded conversations, obtained specifically because Massino himself had arranged to capture them. The man who had once enforced omertà with lethal seriousness became, in the end, the single most complete violation of that same code the family's entire history had ever produced. This is, ultimately, why the story this account has traced across these 10 sections deserves to be measured against the far more sentimental, far more romanticized version of organized crime loyalty that popular film has spent decades presenting to audiences. Goodfellas, the film this broader examination of organized crime history has repeatedly used as its point of comparison, treats betrayal as the singular, shocking exception to an otherwise functioning system of brotherhood and honor among men bound by shared history and shared risk. The betrayal in that film lands as tragedy precisely because it violates something the audience has been led to believe genuinely held, right up until the specific moment it finally broke. What this account has actually traced across the full history of the Bonanno family reveals something considerably less comforting than that familiar cinematic structure. Betrayal was never the exception inside this specific organization. It was the operating principle disguised behind exactly the kind of elaborate language, honor, family, blood loyalty, that made the entire arrangement bearable for the men who spent their lives believing in it, right up until their own moment of reckoning arrived, and proved, in case after case across 7 full decades, that the language had never actually described anything real. Maranzano died believing in an empire his own students would not tolerate. Bonanno nearly destroyed his own family chasing power the commission he helped build would never grant him. Galante died trusting bodyguards whose loyalty ran to Sicily rather than to him personally. Napolitano died, with genuine grace and remarkably little bitterness, discovering that even a friendship real enough to survive its own catastrophic revelation could not actually protect him from the consequences that revelation demanded. And Massino, the most careful and most successful boss this entire family ever produced, ended his own career doing precisely the one thing the family's entire founding culture had always insisted was categorically unthinkable: becoming a government witness testifying openly against the very organization his own decades of leadership had been spent protecting. None of this unfolded with the clean, contained shape a film requires to satisfy an audience within 2 hours of running time. It unfolded across 3 generations, from a Sicilian fishing village to a federal courtroom, each new betrayal building directly on the specific failures and specific lessons of everything that had come before it, without ever once producing a version of loyalty durable enough to actually survive contact with sufficient pressure, sufficient ambition, or sufficient personal risk. The family that called itself, through Joseph Bonanno's own chosen memoir title, A Family of Honor, spent its entire documented history demonstrating exactly the opposite lesson at every single turn, and the fact that this same family continued calling itself exactly that, decade after decade, generation after generation, right up until its own last boss broke the code more completely than any single figure in the entire history of the American Mafia, may be the single most honest thing this specific organization ever actually produced. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.